Chapter 584. Why couldn't he touch Shuang? There were probably many possible answers to this question. For example, most people could think that Shuang had followed Supreme Lord Tianlan for many years and had always been loyal to him. Or perhaps she had made great contributions and done countless things for Supreme Lord Tianlan. She had worked hard for him and built a solid foundation for his current foundation. Those who were quick-witted or had many schemes in their minds could probably think that perhaps after so many years, as Supreme Lord Tianlan's most capable subordinate, Shuang was in charge of such a powerful and terrifying force like Fiyunji. Fiyunji had always been famous for its shadows. No one knew how many secrets Shuang knew or was hiding. Among these secrets, were there any secrets related to Supreme Lord Tianlan's dark side? Could there be something that she could use against him? These guesses were mostly in line with everyone's thoughts. However, whether or not they were the truth, Lu Chen didn't know. Supreme Lord Tianlan didn't tell him and he didn't ask. After Supreme Lord Tianlan clearly told him not to touch Shuang, he didn't say a word about this matter. However, at this point, there didn't seem to be anything else to say. Supreme Lord Tianlan knew what he wanted to know and Lu Chen also understood Supreme Lord Tianlan's attitude. The two of them each took what they needed. Therefore, not long after, Lu Chen stood up and bid farewell, leaving the grand hall of Kunlun. When he left, he even brought the door of the hall with him. Therefore, after a moment of light shone in, the hall returned to its somewhat gloomy and dim state. The only difference was that instead of the two people just now, Supreme Lord Tianlan's figure was now alone. He indeed seemed to have a somewhat lonely aura. Supreme Lord Tianlan stared in the direction of the door. After a while, he suddenly sighed softly. His sigh sounded a little melancholy. It wasn't loud, but it was exceptionally clear in this quiet hall. It was also at this moment that another voice suddenly rang out in this hall. It was deep and rich, like thunder rolling slowly in the dark clouds. Your disciple is very good. Why are you sighing? Supreme Lord Tianlan's expression didn't change, as if he was not surprised by the sudden appearance of this voice. However, he frowned slightly at its words and said, "It's rare that you would actually praise a mortal like him." As he spoke, Supreme Lord Tianlan reached into his bosom and took out a shining golden seal. It was the Kunlun seal that he had given to Lu Chen to go to the western continent. The golden radiance of the Kunlun seal gradually brightened, emitting dazzling rays of light. Not long after, a screen of light was formed in front of true Lord Tianlan, reflecting his face with a hint of gold. Needless to say, his big bald head was even reflecting some golden light. Amidst the solemnity and majesty, he revealed a rare comical look. Of course, there were no outsiders here to see this scene. However, even if someone did see this scene, probably no one would dare to make fun of this person. The screen of light condensed in mid-air like a wall of water. It undulated and then gradually calmed down. In the end, when the golden light quieted down, a black shadow appeared behind the light. Its appearance was blurry, but from the voice and the general outline of the shadow, it should be the black dragon that Lu Chen had seen in the depths of the sky and clouds in the forbidden area of Kunlun. Although the dragon behind the shadow seemed to be just an illusion, its disdainful aura seemed to be able to pass through the screen of light. When facing Supreme Lord Tianlan, it more or less restrained itself, but it still seemed to be a little condescending. It said indifferently, "That person is not bad. He's very much like you when you were young." Supreme Lord Tianlan raised his head and stared at the black dragon. After a moment of silence, he said, "You're right." The black dragon shook its huge head as if it was stretching its body. At the same time, it said to Supreme Lord Tianlan, "But he actually left just like that. I thought that at this point he would make you support him even more openly." Supreme Lord Tianlan smiled and said, "He won't. Lu Chen is a smart person. Previously, he said a lot of things to me, including his argument with Shuang, but it was all nonsense. He had already obtained what he wanted to hear the most. That's why he left so decisively and didn't care about Shuang at all." "What is it?" the black dragon asked. Supreme Lord Tianlan said, "He wanted me to clearly tell him that this foundation will be passed on to him in the future." The black dragon snorted and seemed to be somewhat disdainful. That's what you said, but did he dare to believe it? It looked down at perfected Lord Tianlan and said with a hint of mockery, I'm sure he doesn't know what you've done in the past. It's not that hard for you to go back on your word. Supreme Lord Tianlan didn't get angry at the Black Dragon's sharp words, nor did he try to deny it. He only pondered for a moment, then said, He believes me. The Black Dragon laughed as if it had heard something funny. Looks like this young man is as stupid as me. He's the second person in the world who dares to trust you so much. Supreme Lord Tianlan glanced at the Black Dragon and smiled. Although you haven't lived a good life these years, even you can't deny that I've done what I promised you back then, right? The Black Dragon sneered and looked a little mocking, but he didn't deny it. Others might not know, but I know how you got your current position. What? Don't tell me that you can say with a clear conscience that you'll completely keep your promise to that young man. Supreme Lord Tianlan fell silent. The mockery in the Black Dragon's eyes intensified. It shook its body and the golden light on the Kunlun's seal shook for a moment, then gradually retracted. Its huge figure gradually became blurry, but its voice still came through the screen of light. You don't have to pretend in front of me. That young man will just be another sacrifice for you in the future. As the deep voice gradually faded, the golden light disappeared completely and the Kunlun's seal returned to normal, falling back into Supreme Lord Tianlan's hand. Supreme Lord Tianlan clenched and relaxed his hand, putting the seal back into his pocket. He sat on the spot for a while longer, then silently stood up, walked to the door of the hall and opened it. A gust of wind blew in from outside the hall. Supreme Lord Tianlan narrowed his eyes. He stood in the wind, his sleeves fluttering. After a long time, he suddenly smiled. There was a hint of profoundness and vicissitudes in his smile, as well as a hint of carefreeness and arrogance. With his hands behind his back, he looked at the world and said, So what if I kept my promise to him? Boom! Suddenly, there was a rumble in the sky. It seemed to be echoing in the sky, but it also seemed like the heavens were responding to his words. Surprised, Supreme Lord Tianlan raised his head to look. At the same time, the mortals in the world looked up and saw a sudden change in the sky. Rays of light crisscrossed, and not long after, a sea of blood came crashing down, covering the sky and covering the earth. Moreover, this time, it seemed to have pushed over at least 80% of the sky. The rare phenomenon of the Crimson Sea appeared once again. Chapter 585. The phenomenon of a sea of blood that suddenly appeared enveloped the sky above Mount Heavenly Dragon and even the entire enormous city once more. Moreover, it was even more ferocious this time, and it blotted out the sun, leaving behind less than 20% of the sky that wasn't drowned by the sea of blood. And no matter how one looked at it, the last bit of space seemed to be swallowed by the blood sea at any time. This was the human world, the place where the human race had lived and multiplied for countless years. From ancient times to the present, people had long been familiar with the days of working at sunrise and resting at sunset. They were also familiar with the world where the earth was beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. The sky could be sunny or hazy, windy or rainy, exposed to snow and ice, spring, summer, autumn, or winter. People had seen everything and were already used to it. However, no one had experienced and seen the blood sea hanging upside down in the sky. It looked like it would collapse and destroy the entire world at any time. No matter how one looked at it, it seemed to be the doomsday aura that only the devil hell had. Therefore, although nothing had happened for the time being, there were many people who were very disgusted by this blood sea phenomenon. The well-informed Fuyunji sent a report the next day. It clearly pointed out that after the appearance of the blood sea phenomenon, the number of people leaving the immortal city suddenly doubled. Of course, most of those who didn't want to stay in this strange place because of disgust, fear, or simply because they didn't want to stay in this strange place were rogue cultivators and mortals outside the true immortal alliance. In Xianxia, which occupied this prosperous city and had unparalleled strength, there was no such phenomenon of people fleeing. Most people stayed here. The rules in the huge immortal alliance were strict. It was a serious crime to leave rashly. At this special time, it was more likely that they would be charged with the crime of shaking people's hearts. If that happened, they would suffer in the future. Of course, there were people who left the Immortal City in the Immortal Alliance. In fact, there were quite a number of them. However, everyone said that those who left had all kinds of special tasks. They were leaving the Immortal City to do something outside the city and not fleeing. Although there were many women and children among the people who left, there were also some familiar people. Anyway, those who were really powerful and had a way to leave, or at least let their families leave first, even if there were strict rules in the Immortal Alliance. This had been the case since ancient times. Lu Chen and Old Ma stood in a secluded place at the top of Mount Celestial Dragon. They looked up at the surging sea of blood in the sky. As the strong wind blew in the sky, the blood-colored clouds rose and fell, looking like the rolling waves of the sea. It was a very spectacular scene, but it carried a dark red aura, which made people's hair stand on end. They were afraid that the endless sea of blood would fall on their heads in the next moment. Old Ma gasped as he looked at the scene and said, "What the hell is this? It's actually so terrifying. I'm afraid that even the evil devil cult didn't create such a disgusting thing." Lu Chen didn't agree with him. Instead, he thought about it carefully for a while and shook his head at Old Ma. "That's not it." Old Ma was startled and said, "Why? Have you seen something more powerful and more terrible than this before?" Lu Chen nodded and said, "Yes, in the Battle of the Barren Valley, the devil cult Yun, Shou Yang and the other masters, including the southern barbarian fire shaman, opened a kind of god-subduing spell in the Barren Valley. At that time, the weather changed greatly, the sky broke, and there seemed to be evil gods descending in the violent wind and thunder. The scene at that time was much more terrible than it is now." Old Ma was a little surprised. He looked at Lu Chen with a somewhat complicated expression and said, "At that time, I was on the periphery and didn't enter the Barren Valley, so this is the first time I've heard of this." "Well, for so many years, why haven't I heard you mention it?" Lu Chen looked at him and smiled. "Even the dead Baldy knows about this. Have you heard him mention it to others?" Old Ma immediately pursed his lips and shook his head without saying anything more. However, there was still an unconcealable doubt in his eyes. Obviously, he was puzzled by Lu Chen's sudden mention of this matter today. However, Lu Chen didn't seem to have any intention of clearing up his doubts. He glanced at the sky and said, "If I'm not wrong, this is probably just the beginning. More and more terrible things are yet to come." Old Ma rolled his eyes and said snappily, "You make it sound so easy." After a pause, he said gloomily, "I should have hidden in the Western continent and lived a carefree life. In the end, that errand was taken by Chen He. Now I can't go and he can't go either. Now he's staying at home all day, looking like he's out of his wits. He looks quite pitiful." Lu Chen was silent for a moment and frowned slightly. It was unknown if he was thinking of the scene he saw at the door of the bedroom that night. Even with his heart of stone, a look of displeasure appeared on his face. After shaking his head slightly, he sighed and said, "Regardless of what kind of person Chen He is, his wife and child died unjustly. This matter is quite strange and treacherous. We have to investigate it carefully." Old Ma glanced at him and said, "So, that's why you made that promise to Chen He that day?" Lu Chen said lightly, "He should have trusted the dead Baldy more than me." After saying that, Lu Chen didn't seem to want to continue this topic. He changed the topic and said, "By the way, has White Lotus been looking for you recently? I feel like I haven't seen her for a while." Old Ma said, "No, I haven't seen her recently either. When I just came back a few days ago, I saw that she was in a bad mood. She was a little depressed. Since then, she has been locking herself in Su Qingjuan's house and rarely comes out." Lu Chen was slightly surprised and said, "This is rare. If it was in the past, she would have appeared long ago when such a big thing happened. Anyway, she has some friendship with us. Let's go and see her." Old Ma nodded and said, "Okay, she should still be living in Su Qingjuan's house. Let's go and see." After saying that, the two walked side by side in the direction of the house where Su Qingjun lived. Behind them, the blood clouds in the sky were rolling and the blood sea was surging. It seemed to be brewing to set off an even bigger wave. The blood sea phenomenon in the sky of the Immortal City was overwhelming, But there didn't seem to be much change in the Blood Moon City below the Immortal City. Even though the two looked very similar and were vaguely connected in countless ways, the Blood Moon City didn't seem to have changed much. What had changed in some details was that the mysterious aura that suppressed the cultivation of human cultivators in the Blood Moon City had become stronger recently. Ordinary cultivators who came here felt like they had entered hell. Their spiritual power was rolling in the opposite direction, and it was very uncomfortable. So now, except for some necessary personnel, almost no one came to the Blood Moon City. Most of the time, it was empty, like an uninhabited ghost town. But in fact, there was still life here. There were no plants, no animals, but there were two people. Under the dry well in the backyard of the mansion, White Lotus, who was tied up with a rope and unable to move, was pale and curled up into a ball. There was a trace of pain on her face. It seemed that she was suffering the suppression of the omnipresent power here. But other than that, for some reason, there seemed to be a trace of secret pleasure in the depths of her eyes. Because not far from her, on the other side of the dry well, there was a figure who was suffering 10 times or 100 times more. His body was lying on the ground, his hands tearing at his skin and flesh. The ground was dripping with blood. Chapter 586. After an unknown amount of time, the masked man in the dry well finally calmed down. The pain that wreaked havoc in his body seemed to have temporarily forgiven him, quietly hiding in a dark corner. The man's breathing stabilized and he stood up. After tidying up his clothes, he suddenly glanced at White Lotus. The mask was hideous and terrifying, flashing a strange luster, but because of this, the expression on the man's face could not be seen. White Lotus's body shrank slightly, and her face revealed a somewhat fearful expression. As for the little bit of joy in her eyes, it immediately disappeared after the masked man calmed down. Now, she was in a corner of the dry well, her body pressed against the stone wall, and her whole body curled up into a ball. She really looked like a young girl, ignorant and pure, and when she saw the strange man in front of her, she seemed to be very afraid. After a while, even the last bit of panting disappeared. The masked man seemed to let out a long breath, and then raised his eyes to look above. Bai Lian followed his gaze and looked in the same direction. She only saw the round hole above the well. There was nothing there except for the round blood-red sky. "Who are you?" the masked man asked White Lotus in a low and somewhat hoarse voice. White Lotus shrank her body, and then replied timidly, "I just told you, my name is White Lotus, and I am a disciple of the Kunlun party." During the gap between the masked man's words, White Lotus's eyebrows drooped, and she looked very afraid, just like an ignorant girl. But in fact, the corner of her eyes still quietly glanced in that direction, and at the same time, her mind was racing, trying to guess the identity of this person. This was an underground cave and a mysterious city. There was a blood moon anomaly above it, and the floating clouds office and the star hall were heavily guarded outside. It was obvious that this was a great secret. Ordinary people would not even know the specific details of the truth, let alone enter. White Lotus herself did not know the secret below, so she was curious and secretly followed Lu Qin, Oxen, and Black Dog to sneak here. At this time, she more or less came to a realization. No wonder Lu Qin, Fuyunji, and Shui Ying did so many things and searched so hard and almost turned the Immortal City upside down, but still could not find the whereabouts of Elder Ghost. If this person in front of her was indeed Elder Ghost, it would explain why Fuyunji returned without any results. Probably no one would have thought that Elder Ghost would actually be hiding under everyone's noses. However, looking at this person's appearance, especially the painful and even self-mutilating action just now, White Lotus had an idea in her heart. This Elder Ghost did not have an extremely terrifying hidden illness, or he was seriously affected by this underground world that was shrouded by the blood moon radiance. It was even possible that it was both. Elder Ghost seemed to have completely calmed down at this moment. Of course, the mask on his face covered his face, and it was impossible to see whether he was happy or sad. Only a pair of deep light could be seen in his eyes. He looked at White Lotus, and after a moment of silence, he said, "Just an ordinary Kunlun disciple?" White Lotus did not speak, but her heart still slightly tightened. After a moment, she heard Elder Ghost say, "Why would an ordinary Kunlun disciple come here? There are many people guarding outside this cave, right? Also, when you were caught by me, that Taoist technique divine power, was it called snow wind scripture? That thing is not ordinary." White Lotus almost instantly made a decision in her heart, and then said, "I am a disciple of the Kunlun party. My master's Taoist name is Bai Chen, and he was the one who taught me the snow wind scripture. However, he has already passed away, and I have no one to rely on in this immortal city. As for why I came here, it's because I was too bored, so I followed that person named Lu Chen down here to have some fun. Senior, I really didn't mean to disturb you. Please spare me this time, please?" At the end of her sentence, tears welled up in White Lotus's eyes, and she actually looked like she was really about to cry. However, in her heart, her thoughts were spinning rapidly, and she was thinking hard of a countermeasure. Although she was begging bitterly, but in reality, White Lotus's thoughts were very clear in her heart. It was fine if this person was not Elder Ghost, but if he really was Elder Ghost, then it was impossible for him to let her go. What if he let her go and snitched on her, putting her life in the hands of a seemingly innocent and strange young girl? White Lotus herself did not believe this kind of thing, so she also did not believe that this devil sect's last great enemy, who had a terrible reputation and had been the enemy of the righteous factions Xianxia for decades, would make this mistake. Yes, from White Lotus's point of view, the possibility of this monster that was neither human nor ghost being shameless and obscene, or even killing her, was far higher than the possibility of him being kind. Then right now, it was a hopeless situation where she had a slim chance of survival. She seemed to be unable to defeat this person. Then, was there still a chance of survival? Hearing White Lotus's pleading, Elder Ghost looked as expected indifferent, and did not even hesitate at this moment, but coldly looked at White Lotus and said, "Snow wind scripture is indeed a good thing. Your teacher actually passed it down to you. Seems like he values your talent very highly." White Lotus said, "Yes, to tell the truth to senior, teacher only passed down the snow wind scripture to me alone. My other two senior brothers did not obtain this skill." When Elder Ghost heard Till here for the first time, he revealed a little astonishment, and then after a moment of silence, he looked at White Lotus, his voice awe-inspiring, and said, "Didn't expect you to be such a lucky person. That snow wind scripture is a unique skill. Senior, you want it? I will pass it to you." White Lotus directly interrupted, her tone firm, her expression sincere, as if the person in front of her was not her enemy, but her great benefactor who had given her a second life. Elder Ghost paused for a moment, probably did not expect that the little girl in front of him would actually have this kind of attitude. The snow wind scripture, in the eyes of a person at his level, was of course an extremely precious treasure. As long as there was a chance, he would definitely want to take it for himself. But White Lotus's reaction was far from what he had originally expected. For a moment he did not know what to say, and only after a long while did he say, "Isn't this your teacher's painstaking effort? You are the disciple of a Huashan true monarch. Why don't you have the slightest thought of being loyal to him?" A trace of sadness flashed across White Lotus's face, and then said, "I have let senior see a joke. To tell the truth, ever since teacher passed away, I have been bullied and humiliated in the Kunlun party, especially my martial uncle Tianlan. He was even cold-hearted towards me." As she said Till here, she secretly glanced at Elder Ghost from the corner of her eye, and indeed saw that when Elder Ghost heard the name of true monarch Tianlan, his body slightly shook, as if his attention was suddenly focused. White Lotus laughed coldly in her heart, for so many years being crushed and hunted down by true monarch Tianlan. In terms of the person who had the greatest resentment towards true monarch Tianlan, there was probably no one in the world who could be more resentful towards true monarch Tianlan than this Elder Ghost. Whether there was a chance of survival would depend on how deep this Elder Ghost's hatred towards true monarch Tianlan was. Chapter 587. It had been a few days since the murder of women and children happened on Mount Sky Dragon. This incident had a great impact. It was said that even a few demigod true monarchs were paying attention to it. After all, this incident happened on Mount Sky Dragon, in the heart of Xianxia. To some extent, It was equivalent to slapping the faces of all the people in Xianxia. Fortunately, the devil cult had basically been defeated, and it was difficult for them to stir up trouble again. In this bloody incident, no one found any clues related to the devil cult at the scene. Otherwise, it would probably cause another uproar. 10 years ago, no, at most 5 years ago, or even shorter, the only sect in the world that dared to do such a terrible thing to the core of the true Immortal Alliance's sphere of influence was the devil cult, the evil sect. And according to the usual practice, after the devil cult did such a thing, they must leave a trace to prove their identity. This was equivalent to announcing to Xianxia and even the whole world that this earth-shattering event was done by them. Therefore, this time the scene was so clean. In fact, it also proved that the devil cult seemed to have nothing to do with this incident. This also made many people in Fuyunji heave a sigh of relief. After all, if one were to talk about the motive of the murder, the number one suspect who hated Xianxia and his family to the bone would probably be the devil cult. As for those enemies in Xianxia because of the conflict of interests, it was unlikely that they would do such a thing. But now that the truth was in front of them, Xianxia and his family were killed, Xianxia's face was completely lost, Fuyunji and even true monarch Tianlan's faces were slapped, so many people, including the various forces in Xianxia and the big and small forces in the big immortal city, paid special attention to the movements of Fuyunji during this period of time. Was there any movement in Fuyunji? Of course there was. After such a big event, if there was no movement, then wouldn't they be no different from a stone man? From Shui Ying to the bottom of the Floating Clouds Division, the entire organization of the Floating Clouds Division seemed to have been mobilized. They started their investigation from the Heavenly Dragon Mountain and continued their pursuit. Their spies were everywhere, tracking down every single suspicious clue and suspicious person. As for whether or not this was of any use, outsiders had no idea. Everyone only knew that the terrifying murderer had yet to be caught. However, the Fuyun Agency's search efforts were getting stronger and stronger. The entire immortal city seemed to be restless because of them. It was just that the majority of people didn't dare to resist. After all, it was clear that the Fuyun Agency was truly anxious this time around. Regardless of whether it was the humiliation of being slapped in the face or the threat of the true monarch, who was at a higher level and had an awe-inspiring aura, they quickly turned into pressure on the people of the Floating Cloud Service. Regardless of whether that murderer was dead or alive, they had to find him. The whole immortal city was solemn. It seemed like even the prosperity of the past had lost its color. Perhaps under the pressure of such a strong force, the people had become cautious and cautious. Since he was very young, he was basically a very cautious person. His parents died when he was young, and he had a younger brother who was even more immature to take care of. Along the way, he had really suffered a lot. When he was young, it was to eat his fill. When he was older, he entered the Kunlun party to climb up. Everything was for a better life, so that he could be more at ease. Yes, he had never been at ease. In the depths of his heart, he always felt that he would always be the child who pulled his young and immature younger brother and stood helplessly and hopelessly on the streets. He had no sense of security. He had nothing. He always felt that everything in his hands could be lost at any time. Everything now was like a child's naive and exaggerated dream. When he woke up, everything was empty, and he returned to that terrifying, lonely, and hopeless world. He had never spoken of this feeling to anyone, including his younger brother, Gang. Originally, everything seemed to be slowly getting better. He had become Dukan Jinren's disciple, his cultivation had advanced, his reputation had risen, and his future was limitless. Everything would get better. But later, so many things happened one after another. His younger brother died, and he didn't know who the real killer was. His master also died, and the real killer was himself. Some paths had been taken wrongly, and it turned out that there was really no turning back. Every night, when it was dark and silent, when he was alone, he would think about the past, wondering if there was a second path he could choose. However, there was no medicine for regret in this world, even if it seemed that the choice he made was completely wrong. Perfected Lord Tianlan was not someone he could trust at all. Even though he had done so many things for this perfected lord, Betraying his master whom he was indebted to and betraying the first half of his life, he was perhaps as insignificant as an ant in perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes. He felt that he was about to lose everything. He was extremely afraid of this. Even if everyone in the world thought that he was strong and powerful, he knew that he was weak and timid inside. He could never let himself be in a situation where he had no one to rely on again. It was Tianlan who had betrayed him first. Everything he had done was just to let himself live better, or even just to survive. Chapter 588. Lu Chen and Old Ma called outside the room where Su Qingjun used to live for a long time, but there was no movement in the room. The doors and windows were closed tightly. Looking at the situation, it was obvious that either the person in the room did not want to see them at all, or there was no one in the room at all. The two looked at each other, and their faces were a little ugly, because this was not the first time they came to find White Lotus but did not get any results. From their conversation that day, they remembered that they had not seen White Lotus for a long time. This was the third time they came here, but every time they came, the door was closed. If it happened once or twice, it could be said that it was a coincidence that White Lotus did not go out, but they did not see her 3 times in a row. Moreover, Lu Chen and Old Ma were both careful people, and they had secretly inquired before. These days, no one in Fuyunji had ever seen White Lotus. So, either White Lotus did not go out at all these days and locked herself inexplicably in the room as if she was meditating, or something happened that they did not know. Old Ma looked at Lu Chen and whispered, "Something is wrong." Lu Chen nodded, and at the same time, he also understood the meaning in Old Ma's words that was not clear, but very obvious. After a moment of silence, he nodded and said, "Let's go in and have a look." The door was tightly shut and locked, but this was just an ordinary house. It was not the kind of immortal's cave that was protected by a powerful magic circle or a powerful mechanism. For the two of them who had been in the dark world for so many years, there was not much difference between having a barrier and not having a barrier. Old Ma nodded, walked over, stood in front of the door, and used his body to block his hands. At the same time, Lu Chen walked behind him calmly and naturally, with his back to Old Ma, facing the road outside and glancing around. In order to meet White Lotus, they had purposely chosen a night when they were most likely to be at home. Therefore, there was no one on the road outside. Old Ma stood still, and because his body was blocking the view, they couldn't see what he was doing. But after a while, they heard a muffled sound, and then there was a clatter behind the door, as if something had fallen to the ground. Old Ma breathed a sigh of relief and pushed the door with his hand. The door creaked open. A cool breeze blew past them. Lu Chen and Old Ma both frowned and walked in. The room was still a little dark, but everything was laid out before them, and looking round, they had their answer. "There's no one in this house," Old Ma said in a deep voice. Lu Chen walked to the side of the table, touched the surface of the table, glanced at it, and said lightly, "No one has cleaned here for a few days." Old Ma looked around and said, "The furniture is good and neatly arranged. No one has done anything here." Lu Chen nodded, and after a moment of silence, said, "She left here by herself and never came back." The two looked at each other, and then fell silent. Because of the strange Blood Sea anomaly in the sky, the scenery in Immortal City and Mount Celestial Dragon had become very strange. During the day, the light was blocked by the Blood Sea in the sky, so many places were very dark, but in the middle of the night, when everything was quiet and dark, many places were brighter than usual because of the strange dark red light emitted by the Blood Sea anomaly in the sky. Lu Chen and Old Ma walked on the road. The dark red light shone on them, and even their faces seemed to be a little red. Usually at this time, the road should be dark, but now they could see the surrounding scenery clearly. However, everything was smeared with a layer of red, and it looked a little frightening. After walking for a while, Lu Chen suddenly said, "You go back first, I'll go to Kunlun Temple." Old Ma was shocked and his mind turned. After a moment, he frowned and said in a deep voice, "What do you want to do?" Lu Chen said, "White Lotus has a special identity. Although she is usually not favored by that damn Baldy, as long as Fuyunji and that damn Baldy don't fall, and she doesn't provoke those soul-severing old men, no one in Zhengxianmeng will dare to touch her. The only one who has that idea. At this point, Lu Chen stopped and didn't continue, but old Ma already understood what he meant, and his frown deepened. He looked at Lu Chen and said, "What you said may be right, but what do you mean by going to immortal like this? Do you want to question him for White Lotus?" He snorted and said, "Don't blame me for scolding you. I can't see that you have such deep feelings for her." Lu Chen was silent for a moment, but he shook his head and said, "You're wrong. I don't think it was done by that damn Baldy. It's just that she is the person chosen by that damn Baldy, so I must go and confirm with him. If even that damn Baldy doesn't know something happened to White Lotus, then this matter must be carefully investigated." Old Ma was stunned for a moment, and then he nodded. It was true. White Lotus was the last disciple of Hakushin Jinkuan. Although she was not loved by the current immortal Tianlan because of the conflict between the factions in the sect, she was still his niece in name. Because of this, immortal Tianlan absolutely couldn't let anything happen to her. Although it was somewhat ironic, White Lotus was more like a memorial arch now. Immortal Tianlan could push down and destroy it whenever he wanted, but it was absolutely impossible for others to do it. Old Ma left first, and Lu Chen turned in the direction of the Kunlun Temple. At the same time, he began to recall the appearance of that girl, White Lotus. To be honest, White Lotus was a very unique existence out of all the women he knew. She and Lu Chen had always been in a state where it was difficult to tell who was friend or foe. The relationship between the two of them was also very ambiguous. There were even a few times when they had fought, and they had dealt fatal blows. Of course, Lu Chen didn't have any romantic feelings for this beautiful but unusually fierce girl. At least, he didn't think about it in that way at all. But for some reason, after discovering the abnormality of White Lotus, he almost immediately decided to investigate it without thinking. What was the reason? Could it be that the girl was beautiful after all? Would someone born with a beautiful and exquisite face have such a huge advantage over an ugly person? Lu Chen couldn't help laughing in his heart and put these boring thoughts aside. He thought that he should still be indifferent to White Lotus, at least now he was not nervous at all. In this way, he walked to the front of the Kunlun Temple. After reporting, although it was late at night, the order of Immortal Tianlan quickly came out and asked him to go in. From this, it could be seen that Lu Chen indeed had a special position in Immortal Tianlan's heart. When Lu Chen walked to the Kunlun Temple, he saw Immortal Tianlan sitting in the hall thoughtfully. Although it was late at night, it seemed that this bald immortal was still not sleepy at all. Without beating around the bush, Lu Chen directly walked over and sat beside him. Then he said, "White Lotus is missing. I can't find her." The expression on Immortal Tianlan's face didn't seem to change. He just raised his head and glanced at him. Lu Chen took a deep breath and said, "Did you want to kill her?" Chapter 589. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at Lu Chen for a while before saying calmly, "I didn't give such an order and I didn't mean to do so recently." His words were a little strange and there seemed to be some repetition in their meaning. However, Lu Chen understood and nodded silently. Given Perfected Lord Tianlan's current power and status, he could naturally end someone's life with a single word. However, if it was inconvenient for him to kill someone, there were many ways to do it for him. As long as the people around him knew what he meant, countless people would do it for him. Perfected Lord Tianlan clearly said that he didn't want to kill White Lotus, at least not recently. This was very important and crucial. However, although Lu Chen was a little less worried because of this, he frowned again. If it wasn't done by Perfected Lord Tianlan, where could White Lotus have gone? Lu Chen lowered his head and pondered for a while. Then, he felt Perfected Lord Tianlan's gaze on him. After a moment of hesitation, he calmly told him the entire process of him looking for White Lotus. In the end, he said softly, "I feel that this matter is a little strange, so I came to tell you." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him and suddenly smiled, as if he didn't care about White Lotus's fate at all. He merely sized up Lu Chen and said with a smile, "Are you suspecting me? Aren't you afraid that I'll get angry because of this?" Lu Chen shook his head. "I'm not suspecting you. I'm just here to confirm with you." He paused for a moment before continuing, If you really had feelings for her, she would definitely die. At the same time, she wouldn't have left so many loose ends. Perfected Lord Tianlong laughed. You're quite confident in me. Lu Chen said, after all, you're the one who nurtured me. There's probably no one in the world who knows how powerful you are more than me. Perfected Lord Tianlong said, seems like you've improved your other skills while you weren't by my side all these years. You're really good at flattery. You're not embarrassed at all. You're better than me when I was young. Lu Chen lowered his head slightly and said, you flatter me. When I was in the evil cult, I learned it myself in order to survive. Perfected Lord Tianlong's expression froze for a moment before returning to normal. After pondering for a moment, he said, wait a moment. In front of Lu Chen, true Lord Tianlong stood up and called his subordinate who was on duty outside the hall, ordering him to call Shui Ying from Fuyunji over. Lu Chen subconsciously glanced at the sky outside the main hall, only to see waves of blood surging in the night sky, dark red light blotting out the sky. Although it was late at night, it didn't seem much different from daytime. Of course, this was not a good time to meet and chat. If an ordinary person were to disturb a friend at this time, the other person would probably turn hostile and scold them for having a hole in their brain. However, when Perfected Lord Tianlong gave this order, his expression was indifferent, as if everything was natural. Perhaps in his eyes, this world, the entire world should revolve around him. He had never cared about, or rather, considered the feelings and thoughts of most of the people around him. He only did what he wanted to do. However, the most terrifying thing was that after so many years, the achievements he had, the strength he possessed, his prestige, and his power had made all of this a matter of course. Lu Chen lowered his eyes slightly, his face expressionless. However, he was secretly thinking about how Shui Ying would feel if she, who was lying in a warm bed, was suddenly woken up and forced to rush here. Would she secretly scold this damned baldy for having a hole in his brain? Lu Chen was suddenly very curious about this. Nowadays, Xianxia was becoming more and more bloated, and the efficiency of many halls was deteriorating. They were dragging their feet, which was depressing. However, this did not include Fuyunji. For many years, they had been fighting bloody battles with the devil cult, and under the strong management of true Lord Tianlong, who was different from ordinary people, the Fuyun Bureau still had a capable atmosphere. As the hall master of the most powerful hall in Xianxia, Shui Ying really set an example. Not long after Perfected Lord Tianlong's order was passed down, she had already rushed to the main hall of Kunlun in no more than a quarter of an hour. Someone had already instructed that if Shui Ying came, there was no need to inform her and that she could come in directly. Therefore, Shui Ying hurried all the way, looking a little anxious. It seemed that she was a little worried that there might be something urgent here with Perfected Lord Tianlong. However, when she walked into the main hall of Kunlun and saw that Lu Chen was also sitting there, a strange expression appeared on her face. For a very long time in the past, she was often the only one who could accompany Perfected Lord Tianlong to do things and preach in the middle of the night. Shui Ying took a deep breath, but a smile appeared on her face. It was as if she had suddenly completely forgotten the unpleasantness from a few days ago. She first nodded at Lu Chen in greeting, then faced Perfected Lord Tianlong and bowed solemnly. She said softly, "Milord, are you looking for me?" Perfected Lord Tianlong nodded, but did not say anything. He only pointed at Lu Chen. Seeing Shui Ying's somewhat surprised gaze turn towards him, Lu Chen had no choice but to tell her about White Lotus again. At the same time, he was also secretly observing Shui Ying's expression. After all, Shui Ying's position on Celestial Dragon Mountain was special. She had been in a delicate situation recently, but she still had such a powerful force in her hands. If she really wanted to do something, even Lu Chen was not confident that he could completely stop this woman. Perhaps only Perfected Lord Tianlong could completely suppress her. After hearing Lu Chen's words, Shui Ying was first surprised, then a thoughtful expression appeared on her face. At the same time, Perfected Lord Tianlong slowly opened his mouth and called out to Shui Ying. "Shui Ying, your subordinate is here." Shui Ying bowed respectfully to Perfected Lord Tianlong. Perfected Lord Tianlong said, "I asked you to secretly watch over White Lotus, right?" Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat. Shui Ying nodded and said, "Yes, I have already arranged for people to watch over her. When she did something unusual a few days ago, we stopped her. However, ever since you agreed to let her go to the western continent's Kunlun mountain, she seemed to be much more well-behaved when she returned to the Immortal City. Furthermore, you only told me not to let her leave the Immortal City casually. You did not forbid her from leaving the Immortal City on normal days, so I have probably slacked off a little. They will only appear near the borders of the Immortal City. At other times, they are probably careless." Her expression was solemn as she said to Perfected Lord Tunlun, "This matter is my dereliction of duty. Please give me a few days' time. I will make the arrangements now and definitely find out the whereabouts of White Lotus and report it to you." Perfected Lord Tunlun said indifferently, "We can talk about other things later. First, go and ask where White Lotus was last seen and who she has been in contact with recently. Investigate properly." Shui Ying nodded and said, "Yes." She then stood up and quickly left the hall. Sitting at the side, Lu Chen, who had not said a word throughout the entire process, frowned and said, "From what you said just now, could it be that you suspect someone?" Perfected Lord Tianlan harumphed and said coldly with a murderous expression, "In this immortal city, the only ones who dare to go against me and play tricks in the dark are those 4 to 5 old soul formation cultivators. It's good that this matter has come. I was planning to have a good chat with them anyway." Lu Chen looked at his expression and did not say anything. However, he only felt a slight chill around him. The night outside the hall seemed to be getting colder and colder. The wind was also getting stronger. Chapter 590. At daybreak, Lu Chen walked down from Sky Dragon Mountain and strolled on the streets of the Immortal City. The strange and gloomy sea of blood phenomenon in the sky had already seriously affected the most bustling and largest city in the world. In the past, at this time, the Immortal City would have already started to bustle with people coming and going in an endless stream. But today, when Lu Chen walked on the streets, he found that the surroundings seemed a little cold and desolate. There were only a few people coming out from the streets. Some people had left, and some people stayed but were unwilling to go out. Even those who walked out of their houses looked heavy and depressed. After all, the terrifying sea of blood above their heads didn't look like a scene of doomsday no matter how they looked at it. How could anyone be happy about it? Lu Chen frowned slightly. He had thought of this scene before, but he did not expect it to be worse than what he had expected. Although the blood sea phenomenon was only a scenery floating in the sky and had never caused any substantial harm to the people in the Immortal City, the atmosphere was still unbearably oppressive. He did not even need to go to Fuyunji to know that the daily reports there must be more and more people leaving. At the far edge of the sky, about 20% of the sky was still bright. It was the original sky with a clear blue color and a few white clouds. There was also the sunlight from the sun that should have risen at this time, reflecting a faint golden light at the edge of the blood sea, telling people that this world was not originally like this. What would the future be like? No one knew. Lu Chen retracted his gaze and suddenly felt a little dispirited. He thought of White Lotus, whose whereabouts were unknown and whether she was alive or dead. He suddenly thought that perhaps leaving this city was also a good way to live. When he sensed this thought, he was also stunned. Although he had thought of escaping this place before, after Supreme Lord Tianlan came out and officially accepted him as a disciple, he announced to the world that he was going to hold a disciple acceptance ceremony and made it clear that this great foundation would be passed to him in the future. Lu Chen had long given up on this idea of escaping. His thoughts were all in this intense and violent power struggle to gain a firm foothold and fight for everything. He had never considered this bitter. Perhaps he was born a commoner. For the sake of power, for the sake of power, for the sake of strength, he could give up everything. He cursed that damned Baldy all day long, but perhaps in the depths of his heart, what he yearned for the most was to become that kind of person. But on this day, for some unknown reason, his will seemed to be slightly shaken. Perhaps, it was just an inexplicable melancholy on the morning of a new day. Lu Chen laughed bitterly in his heart. Just as he was about to leave, he suddenly saw a somewhat familiar figure walking over from the street in front of him. The other party also seemed to see him, and a trace of surprise appeared on his face as he stopped in his tracks. It was Song Wenji. On the street in the early morning, under the oppressive and gloomy sky, they met by chance on this cold and desolate street. Morning. Lu Chen was the first to speak. He nodded at Song Wenji politely but not politely, greeting her. Song Wenji also revealed a trace of a smile. In this oppressive and gloomy street, her appearance was still beautiful. Moreover, perhaps it was Lu Chen's misconception. Under her familiar charm, on this morning, Song Wenji's clear and bright eyes faintly carried a trace of strange innocence. Like a playful child, longing for the beautiful scenery outside the house, secretly running out of the house early in the morning, breathing in the fresh air, running to her heart's content on the small path between the mountains. Her skirt fluttered, the cool breeze swept past her smiling face and hair, leaving behind a clear and melodious laughter like a wind chime. That was an innocent child, that was a beautiful time. Elegant like a bubble, bursting in an instant. She stood under this terrifying dark red sky, still that enchanting seductress. She buried her innocence, changed her smile, walked over and said with a smile, "Were you busy last night? Why are you here so early in the morning? Did you just come down from the mountain?" Lu Chen said smoothly, "Last night, my teacher came to talk to me about something, but it was delayed, so I just came down from the mountain. What about you?" Song Wenji seemed to say it casually, "I also. Oh, I went to bed early last night. When I woke up in the morning, I was moved and wanted to go out for a walk." She changed her words. Lu Chen noticed this. After glancing at Song Wenji, he thought that maybe she felt that it was not nice to say that. Lu Chen could stay with perfected Lord Tianlong for a whole night to discuss things, but if she told others that she stayed with perfected Lord Tiehu for a whole night, no matter what she said or did, there would probably be countless rumors immediately. Even though the rumors had already spread like wildfire, it was still a rumor. But no matter what, it seemed that this woman still wanted to maintain her mood and dignity this morning. Lu Chen smiled and nodded, saying to Song Wenji, "You are the most comfortable. I have been busy all night and haven't eaten anything yet. How about this, have you eaten? I'll treat you to breakfast." Breakfast? Song Wenji looked at Lu Chen with some surprise. For successful cultivators like them, the normal need for food had actually been reduced to a negligible level. Most of the time, they only had a taste for ordinary people's food. However, perhaps it was because Lu Chen's smile looked gentle, or because in the past few years, after the rumors about her and perfected Lord Tiehu spread, no other man dared to invite her out like this. Was it because he was the disciple of perfected Lord Tianlong? Her heart jumped a few times, then she suddenly revealed a smile. That little bit of pure joy was mixed with the beauty that could charm all living beings. She nodded heavily and said, "Okay." The Immortal City was a huge city with countless people. Although there were many cultivators, there were even more ordinary mortals living here. Because of Xianxia's strong maintenance of order, cultivators and mortals were like two completely different classes, living peacefully in this city. To eat breakfast, of course, they had to go to a place where mortals lived. Lu Chen led Song Wenji through a few streets, came to a street where mortals lived, and turned into a very lively alley. Then, in front of them, was an extraordinarily lively stall. Along the alley, there were at least a few hundred people, either standing or sitting, eating breakfast here, talking and laughing, as if the smoke of the mortal world was blowing in their faces. "Let's do it here, what do you think?" Lu Chen smiled and turned back, saying to Song Wenji. However, the moment he turned back and saw Song Wenji, he was suddenly startled. He saw Song Wenji standing beside him, staring blankly at the alley in front of her. Her eyes were deep, as if she saw something that stirred up her emotions. She actually stood there motionless, as if she did not hear Lu Chen's words at all. Many years of time, at that moment, seemed to flow backward, gently flashing past her eyes. She had a happy and beautiful childhood. Holding that soft and warm hand, she ran here, pointed at the stall, and shouted with a smile, "Sister, let's eat there." "Miss Song?" Lu Chen's voice rang in her ears, awakening Song Wenji from her memories. Her body trembled slightly, and then she slightly lowered her head. After a moment, when she raised her head again, she revealed a smile and said to Lu Chen softly, "Come, I know a very delicious stall here, I'll take you there." Chapter 591. A small wooden table and a shabby chair were placed casually on the roadside of the alley. A canvas was propped above their heads. Usually, it was used to shield them from the sun and rain. But now, it also blocked the dark red glow above their heads, making people feel at ease for no reason. A bowl of wonton, a little sesame oil, sprinkled with fresh green onions, was steaming hot and fragrant. It was somewhat appetizing, making people salivate and have an appetite. A big bowl was placed at the corner of the table, with chopsticks and spoons inside. Song Wenji happily took the white porcelain spoon, squinting her eyes to smell the fragrance. She took a deep breath, revealing a somewhat satisfied expression on her face. Lu Chen looked at her from the side, and then looked at the same bowl of wonton in front of him. After a moment of hesitation, he also picked up the spoon and scooped a mouthful of soup, tasting the taste. Song Wenji was not in a hurry to eat, revealing a somewhat expectant expression. She looked at Lu Chen and said with a smile, "How is it? Is it delicious?" Saying this, she sighed again and said, "This is an old stall for many years. I ate here when I was a child. The taste is too delicious." Lu Chen looked at the bowl of wonton in front of him. A glimmer of light flashed in the depths of his eyes, and then he raised his eyes to look at Song Wenji. This woman, in Tianzhu Hall and even in Zhengxianmeng, with her identity as the adopted daughter of immortal Tiehu, could be said to be in the limelight of the younger generation. Even if she could not completely do as she pleased, but most of the time, she should be free to do whatever she wanted. She had been in Tianzhu Hall for a few years, but in these few years, listening to the meaning of her words, it seemed that she had never returned here to eat the food that she had always been thinking about. Was it because she had been too busy these years and had no time to come over, or was there another reason? And these words, which vaguely revealed some secrets, were heard by ordinary people, but for Lu Chen, it was very easy for him to detect the subtle inappropriateness of it. Logically speaking, Song Wenji should have known about Lu Chen's identity and the suspicious points in her words, but she still said it. What did that mean? Lu Chen was silent for a moment, but he didn't answer Song Wenji's question. Instead, he smiled at her and said, "Looks like you're in a good mood today. Did anything good happen recently?" "How could there be anything good? There should be a lot of bad things." Song Wenji sighed and scooped some soup with a spoon, but she didn't drink it. It seemed that she was afraid of the heat. She swirled the soup in the bowl twice and said, "Do you know what happened in the rain-listening building on the mountain a few days ago?" "Yes, I went there that night too. I watched from outside the building," Lu Chen said. Song Wenji glanced at him. For some reason, she seemed a little embarrassed. Her cheeks blushed slightly. At that moment, she was as tender and beautiful as a peach. She was a little shy and a little melancholy. She sighed and said, "I lost face. Did you see it that night? I was very embarrassed, wasn't I?" Lu Chen said seriously, "A little embarrassed, but when it comes to losing face, it's definitely not like that. That matter has nothing to do with you. It's all that perverted thief's evil deeds. He deserves to die 1,000 times, but you are innocent and implicated." Song Wenji's eyes flickered like sparkling gems. She didn't look like a little girl who was sad and tearful. She always looked beautiful and charming with a bit of heroic spirit and strength. It was rare to see her weak side. She looked thoughtful and said, "What you said makes sense. Unfortunately, the world is like this. When a woman is humiliated, even if she doesn't lose her chastity, there will be endless rumors." She looked at Lu Chen and asked, "In the past few days, have you heard those rumors about me?" Lu Chen was silent. He didn't know what to say for a moment. To be honest, he had indeed heard those rumors. In this cultivation world where men were respected, a beautiful woman with her clothes torn and tattered at night would naturally cause people's imaginations to run wild and imagine many things and scenes. When it came to these matters, Lu Chen sometimes felt that there was no difference between cultivators and mortals. He didn't say anything, but Song Wenji naturally knew the answer. She shrugged and didn't look particularly angry. She only smiled and said, "But it seems like you don't believe it. That's not bad. People like you are very rare. I thank you." Lu Chen waved his hand and said, "If I really believed those nonsense, then I would be stupid." Song Wenji's bright eyes stared at him. The expression on her face seemed to be somewhat complicated. After a while, she suddenly opened her mouth and asked Lu Chen, "I heard that a long time ago, you were a shadow in Fuyunji?" Lu Chen's heart trembled slightly, but his expression didn't change. He nodded and said, "That's true." Song Wenji seemed to sigh and said, "To be able to go from a shadow that no one knows about to becoming the disciple of a true monarch in the Floating Clouds Bureau, your experiences can really be said to be legendary." "I just had a bit of luck," Lu Chen said lightly. Then he looked at her and said with a smile, "Everything was fine. Why are you suddenly interested in my past?" Song Wenji didn't say anything. On this depressing and gloomy morning, in this bustling mortal street, they sat on a shabby table and chair in the middle of the crowd, like an ordinary husband and wife in the mortal world. They looked at each other with calm expressions. The people around them didn't seem to notice anything, using the smoke and fire to cover the faint fierceness in their eyes. "What does it feel like to be a shadow?" But she shook her head, and with an indifferent expression, she stood up and said, "It's not good anymore. The taste of when I was young is gone." As she spoke, she threw down the spoon and turned to walk away. Not long after, she left the warm and bustling alley, but in the eyes of cultivators, seemed to be a bit lowly and ordinary. She walked away without looking back. Chapter 592. Old Ma, who had a good night's sleep last night, was in good spirits today, and even his mood was better. Although his situation was not particularly good during this period of time, there were still some annoying things. For example, the way to leave the immortal city, which was a troublesome place, was inexplicably taken away by Chen He. But now that he thought about it, things were actually not too bad. Although the sea of blood in the sky above looked very scary, the legendary or imagined doomsday had not yet appeared. No one knew what the future would be like. Maybe it would be fine? And Chen He, who was proud of his success a few days ago, had his family destroyed overnight. This also made Old Ma secretly feel a little lucky. Perhaps this matter was not necessarily related to leaving the immortal city, but who could say for sure whether it was a blessing or a misfortune? It was better to be content with what he had and do what he had to do now. Besides, Lu Chen's position in Supreme Tianlan's faction was obviously rising day by day. It seemed that his future was not too bad. With this self-comfort, Old Ma felt that life had suddenly become better, and his mood was also cheerful. Many years ago, when he and Lu Chen were still living in seclusion in the remote mountain village of Qingshitang village, he was already very familiar with this set of spiritual victory method. Thus, when he walked briskly up Celestial Dragon Mountain and found Lu Chen outside the main hall of the Floating Clouds department, Lu Chen stared at his cheerful and spirited appearance for a long time. Then he asked suspiciously, "Why are you so happy? Could it be that you have encountered some great news?" Old Ma chuckled and said, "What are you talking about? I'm in a good mood today, so can't I be happy?" Lu Chen raised his head to look at the gloomy and oppressive sky, and then turned to look at the austere and solemn Floating Clouds Bureau, as well as those people who always had solemn and grave expressions on their faces. He then said to Old Ma honestly, "Everyone on this mountain has a bitter expression on their faces. As long as you are the only one who is relaxed and happy, then everyone will find you an eyesore." Old Ma was taken aback. He quickly looked around and found that it was just as Lu Chen had said. After a moment of shock, he hurriedly pulled him aside and asked in a low voice, "Did something happen again?" "Actually, it's nothing big," Lu Chen said. "It's just that the damn Baldy was in a bad mood today. He ran out and quarreled with someone, which caused quite a commotion. He just came back." Old Ma's eyes widened. After a moment he gasped. What was perfected Lord Tianlan's status? Even among Xianxia Meng, who was almost invincible in the world of cultivation, he was now the number one in name and in reality. The number one person in Xianxia was, of course, the number one person in the entire cultivation world. Such a big shot went out to quarrel with someone today? And it caused quite a commotion? Old Ma was not stupid. Although Lu Chen's words did not make it clear, he could figure out that there were only a few people on Mount Tianlong who were qualified to quarrel with perfected Lord Tianlong. As for other people, even if they were Yuaning Zhenren, in front of an angry perfected lord of Huashan realm, they were more likely to be sent flying with a slap, rather than quarreling with words without violence. Old Ma's original joy suddenly dissipated, but he was not too depressed. After all, it seemed that a fight between immortals would not involve a small figure like him. Instead, he was a little more curious. He pulled Lu Chen and asked, "Which perfected lord is it?" He paused, thought for a moment, and said, "I guess it's most likely perfected Lord Tiehu." Perfected Lord Tiehu was old-fashioned and upright. In Zhengxianmeng, perfected Lord Tianlong was not very pleasing to the eye. Everyone knew that there were conflicts between Tianhun Hall and Fuyunji from time to time. Therefore, Old Ma's first reaction was that these two old enemies were quarreling again for some reason, but he did not expect the reaction to be so big this time. Unexpectedly, Lu Chen shook his head and said, "It's not perfected Lord Tiehu." Old Ma was stunned and said in surprise, "What? It's not that person? It shouldn't be. Could it be perfected Lord Guanghua from Dezayuan? Is he jealous of Fuyunji's recent profits? It's unlikely for the others. Perfected Lord Golden Dragon?" Lu Chen interrupted him and said, "Stop guessing. It's perfected Lord Guyu from Starry Hall." Perfected Lord Guyu? Old Ma was really shocked this time. There was even a look of disbelief on his face. He said, "It shouldn't be. Isn't Starry Hall on good terms with us recently? Not to mention the other things, Starry Hall handled and guarded the devil cult's catacombs at the foot of the mountain together with us. Why are the two of them quarreling?" Lu Chen shrugged and said, "Who knows? I heard that perfected Lord Guyu punished a few of his trusted disciples. One of them was accused of being too close to Fuyunji. When the news came out, the damn Baldy flew into a rage. He ran to perfected Lord Guyu and quarreled. He even said that your Starry Hall is not clean either. You're always stuffing nails and shadows into Fuyunji. Don't think that we don't know." Old Ma was speechless for a moment. Although what Lu Chen said sounded unbelievable, he really didn't dare to deny it. Because he knew in his heart that these words were very likely to be true. However, there seemed to be something strange about this matter. "Do you feel that there's something wrong with this matter?" Lu Chen pulled Old Ma and walked around the Floating Clouds Department's main hall towards the Kunlun Palace at the back. At the same time, he asked Old Ma in a low voice. Old Ma nodded very honestly. After a moment of silence, he said hesitantly, "Logically speaking, the two of them are of such high status. How could they, they shouldn't quarrel so easily." Lu Chen said faintly, "Because I just talked to the damn Baldy last night. He said that our Fuyunji may have been stuffed with many spies. Maybe there are people who betrayed us and took the initiative to collude with those outsiders. So, the damn Baldy seemed to be very angry early in the morning. When he heard the news from Starry Hall, he angrily went over and quarreled with them." Old Ma was a little stunned and said, "That's it." Lu Chen nodded and said, "That's it." But then he smiled and said thoughtfully, "But I always feel that he seemed to be doing it for someone to see. What do you think?" Old Ma was silent. These words, including some deeper speculations, could be said by Lu Chen at will, but he had some taboos. He looked at Lu Chen from the corner of his eyes. He saw that Lu Chen's face was solemn. He seemed to be thinking about something, but his eyes gradually brightened. Probably he is finally going to start. Chapter 593. Everyone on Sky Dragon Mountain knew that the relationship between the 6 perfected cultivators of the divine transformation realm was a little subtle. The reason for this was very simple and easy to understand. They were all figures who stood at the peak of the cultivation world of the human race, and all other mountains were insignificant. Those who could ascend to this position were all peerless talents. Not to mention aptitude. In this regard, rare talent was only the most basic thing. It could even be said that at this level, precious qualities such as hard work, indomitable spirit, and unyielding perseverance were nothing. Instead, luck and opportunity became the key to the final separation between gods and mortals. Humans were not born to be fair. You have your opportunities, and I have my fate. In short, those who could become deity transformation stage perfected monarchs could almost be seen as divine rights bestowed by the heavens. They were favored by the heavens, so they were naturally proud and arrogant people. They were all great geniuses, all big shots with their eyes on the top of their heads, and all of them thought that they were the best in the world. Therefore, when they saw that there were actually people around them who were similar to them, they would naturally be a little displeased. Regarding this, even the most low-key and peaceful perfected cultivators of the divine transformation realm would probably have such thoughts. Therefore, although these perfected cultivators of the divine transformation realm in Xianxia were highly respected and powerful, they had always kept a certain distance from each other. And the occasional frictions and quarrels between them were like gossip that the people of Sky Dragon Mountain never got tired of, and had always been the topic of people's leisure time for many years. It seemed that this quarrel between the two perfected cultivators of the divine transformation realm, Tianlan and Guyu, seemed to be one of these immortal fights that no one was surprised to see. Although perfected cultivator Tianlan seemed to have gone a little too far by going from his own territory to the Star Hall and quarreling with perfected cultivator Guyu, although no one really heard of it, and no one really felt that there were signs of a big fight or Tao or divine powers inside, the scene was still quite frightening. Perhaps it was because perfected Lord Tianlan was so powerful that he was bursting with ambition and could no longer tolerate being treated as an equal to others. In fact, he could no longer suppress his ambition and was about to take action? This conjecture immediately spread like wildfire after the quarrel between the two bigwigs. In a short time, it spread throughout the entire Sky Dragon Mountain. In the blink of an eye, it even overshadowed the drama of immortal Tiehu punishing the perverted thief in the rain-listening tower for the sake of his adopted daughter a few days ago, and became the focus of everyone's attention. In addition to the fact that both sides of the quarrel were frightening big shots like perfected gods of Huashan realm, there was another point that had secretly attracted many people's attention. According to the original view, perfected Lord Tianlan's Fiyunji was now well-deserved to be the #1 force in Xianxia, and the force closest to them seemed to be Starry Hall. But now, it seemed that perfected Lord Tianlan, who had always been arrogant and condescending, and was arrogant even among perfected lords of the divine transformation realm, had finally lost his rationality and could no longer tolerate anyone's disrespect towards him. So, he went to Starry Hall and scolded perfected Lord Guyu. It was said that perfected Lord Guyu was so angry that his face turned pale at that time, and had a big quarrel with the famous bald perfected Lord Tianlan. During the quarrel, he even disregarded his identity several times and sarcastically ridiculed perfected Lord Tianlan's shortcoming of not being able to grow hair on his head, further infuriating perfected Lord Tianlan. Of course, big shots at this level basically used their mouths and not their fists. Once they started fighting, it would basically cause a landslide. Wise people would not take it and people would not like it. After the incident, everyone in Starry Hall was half dead with anger. After all, everyone was a famous force in the world, and they really could not bear the humiliation when someone came to their door and slapped them in the face. But if that person was called Tianlan, forget it, they had to bear it even if they could not bear it. However, since then, the relationship between Starry Hall and Fiyunji instantly became like fire and water. Both sides were at daggers drawn, and there were many incidents of people quarreling and even fighting each other. It was a joyous occasion. Lu Chen was summoned by someone sent by perfected Lord Tianlan. When he walked to the entrance of Kunlun Hall, he happened to see Shui Ying also there. At the entrance of the hall, the two of them happened to meet. Lu Chen glanced at this woman and found that she seemed to be a little tired. He did not know if it was because she had been too busy recently and was under too much pressure. Thinking about it, it must have been hard on her. Originally, a large hall like Fiyunji already had a lot of affairs to deal with, but the big shot at the top did not stop worrying. He just had to find trouble and quarrel with the perfected lord of soul formation of Starry Hall, causing an uproar in the city. It was enough to give her a headache. Thinking of this, Lu Chen smiled slightly, but took half a step back and made a gesture of letting Shui Ying go first. Shui Ying was obviously startled and could not help but take another look at Lu Chen. Ever since the power struggle outside Qinhe's house, the relationship between the two had deteriorated rapidly. Unexpectedly, Lu Chen seemed to take a step back today. But no matter what, this was also a kind gesture. Shui Ying was not the kind of woman who put everything on the surface. Although she had some doubts in her heart, she still put on a gentle expression and nodded at Lu Chen. After pondering for a while, she still walked through the door first. After all, there were many eyes and ears watching in the surroundings. Perhaps this situation could let them understand something. There were no outsiders in the hall. Only perfected Lord Tianlan sat there and seemed to be cursing. When he saw them enter one after another, his gaze swept across them. His expression did not change much, and he beckoned them over. Seeing that this person seemed to be a little angry and anxious, Lu Chen frowned. He felt that this damn Baldy was a little unusual. At least in his memory, he had almost never seen him not calm like this. When Shui Ying and Lu Chen approached, perfected Lord Tianlan did not let them sit down and talk. He asked directly, "I heard that there were people who had a dispute with Starry Hall and even fought?" Shui Ying nodded and said, "Yes, there were 17 disputes between the two sects in the past few days. I have already dealt with 5 of the fights and detained the people who fought." Perfected Lord Tianlan snorted and said, "Have you found out that it was them who started it first?" Shui Ying hesitated for a moment and a trace of awkwardness flashed across her face. She said, "It was just a verbal argument. Most of the time, it was Starry Hall who started it. However, for the 5 fights, it was us who started it first." Lu Chen rolled his eyes in his heart. He thought to himself, the Floating Clouds Company's reputation for being domineering these days was indeed well-deserved. It was clearly his boss who had acted rudely, scolding others in their territory. In the end, he was still arrogantly bullying others. Perfected Lord Tianlan snorted again and said, "Who won and who lost the fights?" Shui Ying said, "Most of the time, it was our people who won." After a pause, she lowered her voice a little, but the 2 people around her could still hear her clearly. She said, "Most of the time, we have more people. More people bullying less people. This is no different from a street gangster," Lu Chen thought. At this moment, perfected Lord Tianlan said angrily, "Well done, release the people you detained. That old fart Guyu dared to call me Baldy. This time, I must teach him a lesson." Chapter 594. True Lord Tianlan's embarrassment turned into anger after being scolded bald, and then he flew into a rage and even vented his anger. This kind of behavior was very strange and incongruous when it happened to true Lord Tianlan. However, it was common knowledge that every big shot who had reached the level of divine transformation true Lord actually had the right to do as they pleased. Most of the time, they were aloof and seemed to be above the common people, but as long as they were willing, they could also put down their pride and haggle without any scruples. If the same thing happened to an ordinary person, it would be vulgar and shallow, but if true Lord Tianlan did it, Lord True Lord is indeed a man of character. You love and care for your subordinates, and you are also wise and mighty. It is our great fortune to be able to serve you. Shui Ying revealed an excited expression and sincerely expressed her loyalty. At the side, Lu Chen couldn't help but stare at Shui Ying a few more times. The expression of surprise on his face clearly said, "I didn't think that a powerful and arrogant hall master like you would actually know how to flatter." Although Shui Ying's expression remained the same under Lu Chen's gaze, there was still a trace of unnaturalness in her eyes, as if she was a little embarrassed, but she quickly concealed it. True Lord Tianlan seemed to be very satisfied with Shui Ying's attitude. He nodded and said to her, "I trust you when you do things. Let's do as we said earlier and secretly make those people from Starry Hall suffer a little. But don't make things too big. Although I'm not afraid of trouble, I also want to avoid breaking that old man Guyu's tail and making him jump up and bite people." What he meant was that he was directly comparing that person from Starry Hall to a dog. In this world, there was probably only one person who could be so unscrupulous towards a divine transformation true lord. Shui Ying and Lu Chen didn't dare to say anything. Shui Ying agreed and quickly retreated. Lu Chen watched her figure disappear through the door, then looked back at True Lord Tianlan and frowned. She was just flattering you. True Lord Tianlan's expression had already relaxed. Hearing this, he casually spread his hands and said, "Yes, but that was her own action. I couldn't do anything about it." Couldn't do anything about it? There was an old saying, when the superior likes something, the inferior will follow it. Lu Chen shook his head and opened his mouth to say something, but in the end he closed it. True monarch Tianlan did not notice Lu Chen's expression and said to him, "Let Shui Ying handle the matters of scheming with the other mountains in the Immortal Alliance. She is familiar with everything and has experience, so there is no need to worry. I called you here because I have something else to tell you." Shuang asked. Shuang said, "The people below have been investigating for a few days. Although they have not found White Lotus's whereabouts, on the last day, there were people who saw her figure in 3 different places." After saying that, he looked at Lu Chen meaningfully and told Lu Chen 3 locations in chronological order. These 3 places were not on Mount Celestial Dragon but on the streets of the Immortal City. Lu Chen's brows slowly furrowed. He counted the days in his heart and recalled the few hours that Supreme Lord Tianlan had mentioned. Suddenly, his expression changed abruptly. There was shock in his eyes as he raised his head to look at Supreme Lord Tianlan. True Lord Tianlan smiled and said, "Looks like you've thought of it?" Lu Chen took a deep breath and said slowly, "Those 3 hours on that day, I happened to pass by those 3 places." After a pause, Lu Chen narrowed his eyes and said, "So she was secretly following me that day." "Moo!" A low cry came from the entrance of the main hall of Kunlun. Lu Chen looked in that direction and saw Oxen's huge body walking past the entrance of the main hall, followed by a black figure. It seemed to be Atsu. These days, Atsu would often come to play with Oxen. However, since Oxen was suddenly suppressed in the underground cave and suffered a great loss, Atsu's attitude towards Oxen seemed to have a subtle change. They no longer respected Oxen as they used to. They seemed to have realized that Oxen also had a weakness. But no matter what, Oxen was still powerful, so Atsu seemed to be willing to play the role of a follower until now. Lu Chen recalled that he seemed to have been brought into that underground cave by the green ox that day. His heart skipped a beat and he turned to look at Perfected Lord Tianlan again. Before he could speak, Perfected Lord Tianlan had already said, "Go. It seems that you have a clue. I don't care what you're going to do. In short, I want to see her if she's alive, and I want to see her corpse if she's dead." Lu Chen was silent. Then he nodded and turned to walk out. When he walked out of the door, he paused and then barked at Atsu, who was not far away. Atsu took a look at Oxen and quickly ran to him, wagging its tail at him, looking very friendly. Lu Chen said, "Accompany me to do something." Atsu barked. It looked like he agreed. Lu Chen glanced at Oxen, who was lying lazily on the side, and strode over. Seeing that the 2 most capable and powerful people under him had left, True Lord Tianlan sat on the spot for a while and slowly let out a long sigh. A hint of fatigue actually appeared on his face. As if affected by his sigh, a golden light suddenly lit up on his chest. A moment later, the Kunlun seal actually flew out of his clothes and floated in the air. True Lord Tianlan took a look at the Kunlun seal and frowned, but didn't say anything. He casually waved his sleeve in the direction of the door, and an invisible gust of wind blew past. Immediately, there was a series of snapping sounds, and the many doors and windows in the Kunlun Hall were all closed. You have to be careful too. There are eyes and ears everywhere on this mountain. What if someone sees something strange and becomes suspicious? Black Dragon's thunderous voice rang out in the golden light. There seemed to be a hint of mockery in it. Didn't you say that this is the safest and most reliable place in the world? Why are you afraid of that? True Lord Tianlan smiled bitterly and said somewhat helplessly, "Who can really be absolutely safe? Enough of this nonsense." Black Dragon's voice sounded a little impatient. "Let me ask you, This time, when the blood moon is at its peak, we will completely destroy the underground demon clan. This matter is simple and clear to begin with. Why are you stirring up trouble again and again here, giving rise to new problems and tormenting yourself endlessly? If something important is delayed, remember that I won't let you off. Faced with the Black Dragon's sudden threat, true Lord Tianlan's expression didn't change. With a composed expression, he said indifferently, "Don't worry, I will naturally do what I have to do. However, I think you don't mind taking advantage of this rare opportunity to do some trivial things while I'm at it?" The golden light flickered and the Black Dragon's panting could be heard from the depths of the light. At the very least, it sounded a little angry. However, for some reason, such a huge divine beast seemed to be somewhat fearful of true Lord Tianlan. After a while, the Black Dragon sneered and said, "You just have to control yourself. Otherwise, if you mess up something important, don't worry about me turning against you when the time comes." With that, the Black Dragon's voice disappeared. The golden light in the air faded and the Kunlun seal flew back to true Lord Tianlan's hand in a swaying manner. Perfected Lord Tianlan gripped the golden seal gently with a cold expression. Chapter 595. The street leading to the underground city in the White Tiger district of the Immortal City was still tightly guarded. The curtains were still erected to block the curious gazes of ordinary people. However, what was different from before was that only Fiyunji's faction and Starry Hall's Fiyunji's faction were left. As for the reason, it was very simple. After the big fight between true Lord Tianlan and true Lord Guyu of Starry Hall, even if the two factions usually got along well, they were probably not on good terms anymore. Not only could they not get along with each other peacefully, they had to glare at each other, gnash their teeth, curse each other, and yell at each other. Then, the people of the Starry Hall would flick their sleeves and leave in disdain, and the people of the Floating Clouds Agency would take over the situation triumphantly. Everyone was happy, and they all felt that they had won. Not only did they gain face for their boss, but they also stood their ground and avoided hurting themselves. It could be seen that those who could survive in the true Immortal Alliance were all sly and cunning. After Lu Chen came down from the mountain and brought Atsuhir, he saw this very peaceful and joyous scene. Someone had already come up to greet him with a smile. One had to know that this young man's status was not ordinary now. In the future, he might even be able to sit in the position of true Lord Tianlan. Although there was still Hall Master Xue Ying of Fiyunji standing there, and it was said that she was not on good terms with her, no one was stupid. Hall Master Xue Ying of course had true Lord Tianlan's trust and power, but after so many years, why didn't he take Xue Ying in as his disciple? It was said that strength was respected in the cultivation world. However, the invisible and intangible status was still everywhere in reality. Lu Chen very politely greeted the leader of the guards called Lu Ting, and then said to him, "Lord Tianlan sent me over to do something." Lu Ting nodded without hesitation and said, "Of course. Is it enough for you alone? Do you want me to send another team to follow you? Whether it's to run errands or to help with some chores, it's fine." Lu Chen pondered for a moment and said, "I don't think so. But thank you for your good intentions, Chief Lu." Lu Ting laughed heartily, his eyes narrowing as he smiled. He said in an extremely amiable manner, "Young master is too polite. In short, everything will be as you wish. In any case, we are all here. If you need anything, just tell us and we will be there immediately." Lu Chen smiled and nodded. He couldn't help but take another look at Lu Ting. After a moment, he took 2 steps to the side. As expected, Lu Ting followed. Lu Chen smiled and said, "Chief Lu, thank you very much. But I remember that the brothers and colleagues stationed here should be the elites of Fiyunji. If you are so close to me in public, isn't it a little inappropriate? Be careful not to be bullied later." After saying this, Lu Chen paid attention to Lu Ting's expression. Sure enough, Lu Ting's expression stiffened for a moment, but then returned to normal. Then, with a sincere expression, he said, "Young master is thinking too much. But this subordinate will remember this intention. This subordinate belongs to Fiyunji and has been risking life and death here for many years. Although I am slow-witted, I still understand one thing. All the brothers here, including all of Fuyunji, will not belong to anyone other than Lord Tianlanlan. Even if there is such a person, it can only be the one that Lord Tianlan has recognized and recognized. At this point, it was basically impossible to go any further. The occasion and atmosphere were not suitable, but Lu Ting's meaning was very clear. Lu Chen's brows drooped, but he felt a little emotional. Although it had been a few days since he quarreled with Shui Ying, and it had been even longer since he officially became Lord Tianlan's personal disciple, other than old Ma who was originally with him, there was also Qin He, who he had instigated to defect to him, but then defected to Shui Ying's side. During this period of time, no subordinates of Lord Tianlan had come to his side. This Lu Ting, regardless of his position, character, or even strength, was the first person who had intentionally switched sides from the original Fuyunji system. Could this be the beginning? Who would have thought that they would encounter such a thing by accident on this trip? Although the real effect might not be very great, and even Lu Ting's sincerity in defecting still needed to be tested, but in the end, cracks were beginning to appear in the solid Fuyunji system. Lu Chen was still very happy. He smiled and nodded to Lu Ting, whispered a few words to him, and then led Atsu into the underground world through the tunnel entrance. Behind him, Lu Ting respectfully escorted them all the way to the tunnel entrance. Only after Lu Chen's figure had disappeared did he straighten up. At this moment, one of his trusted aides came over and said in a low voice, "There's no one around, our subordinates are all watching." Lu Ting nodded and replied, That trusted aide hesitated for a moment and said, "Brother Lu, will there be trouble if you do this?" Lu Ting snorted and said, "What trouble? I didn't do anything. Young Master Lu Chen is Lord Perfected's disciple. There's nothing wrong with me serving him respectfully. You can't expect a small character like me to treat him coldly, right?" After a pause, he said again, "Pass down the order, no one is allowed to know about what happened today. Even if someone asks, they can only say that I'm a coward and don't dare to slight young Master Lu." "Got it." That trusted aide showed a look of understanding and also smiled. While the two of them were talking, among the ordinary guards in the distance, an ordinary-looking guard who was standing next to a cloth curtain in the periphery glanced over coldly at them. Lu Chen's memory was very good. He would remember many things from a long time ago clearly, no matter if these memories were pleasant or painful, including those days and nights spent in the Devil sect. Therefore, even now, when he was arguing with others, he would suddenly think of the woman who was killed by the evil cult. After a while, he would remember the woman's name and other things. This was somewhat like a talent. Those things seemed to be engraved in his mind. Most of the time, it was just a deep sleep. Lu Chen had long gotten used to this habit of his, even if most of the time, this kind of memory brought him more pain. But on this day, when he once again stepped into the underground city shrouded by the blood moon, when the blood-red light once again fell on his body, Lu Chen suddenly felt the power of the black fire in his body suddenly tremble, as if it was about to boil. Perhaps in the real world outside, the sea of blood in the sky was gradually approaching its climax. Or perhaps for some reason, the strange aura of the underground world was becoming stronger and stranger. At that moment, when Lu Chen was subconsciously suppressing the power of the black fire in his body, he suddenly felt as if there was a roar in his mind. His body trembled, and then there seemed to be a strange bolt of lightning suddenly piercing through the dark sky in his mind, illuminating some of the deep shadows. Suddenly, a drop of sweat quietly slid down his forehead. He stopped in his tracks and was in a daze. At that moment, he discovered that in the memory that he thought was complete, there seemed to be an additional blank space. At the last moment of the Battle of the Desolate Valley, when he woke up again, he had completely lost his memory of that period of time. Chapter 596. In the main hall of the Heavenly Law Hall, it was solemn and dignified as usual, but because of the arrival of a distinguished guest, it added a bit of liveliness to the place. This guest's status was extremely high, so much so that even Immortal Tiehu had to personally go out and greet him. Then he would accompany and chat with him. All the surrounding subordinates were dismissed, leaving only his most beloved adopted daughter, Song Wenji, to serve tea at the side. Looking at the entire Zhangxianmeng and the entire Tianlong Mountain, there were only a few people who could afford the solemn reception of a character like Tiehu Supreme. Needless to say, they were the few big shots who were at the deity stage like him. The person who came to visit today was Zhangxianmeng Guangbo Supreme, who was nicknamed Hidden Minister. This Guangbo Supreme had a venerable status in Zhangxianmeng and had great power. Although generally speaking, the Grand Chancellor that he ruled was not famous for its valiant fighting power, almost no one in the entire Zhangxianmeng was willing to offend them, including the strongest Fuyunji. Because the Grand Chancellor was in charge of the property in Zhangxianmeng and distributed it to each hall according to the rules, for a long time, the Grand Chancellor was the most powerful branch in Zhangxianmeng. That was to say, in the last few decades, the situation has changed. Well, to be exact, in Zhangxianmeng, there was an extremely powerful but often did not act according to the rules, Tianlong Supreme. After founding Fuyunji, this bald Supreme unexpectedly left the Grand Chancellor and set up a lot of his own businesses, and the income was extremely considerable. Of course, it was hard to say how much of this was due to the incomparable strength of Fuyunji. In short, Fuyunji now did not rely too much on the Grand Chancellor. On the contrary, after Fuyunji's power grew and gradually overtook all the halls in Zhangxianmeng, it began to openly and secretly force the Grand Chancellor. The result was that the Grand Chancellor was arrogant and swaggering in front of other halls, but when it saw Fuyunji, it was like a mouse seeing a cat. Not only could it not take advantage of Fuyunji, but it obediently handed over the money every month, and from time to time, it would also be hit by Fuyunji. This was really a shame that the Grand Chancellor had not seen for more than 100 years. As the current leader of the Grand Chancellor, Supreme Guangbo was deeply annoyed, but when they faced Fuyunji, it was like a scholar meeting a soldier. There was really nothing they could do. Even though Supreme Guangbo himself was also a perfected lord of Huashan realm, the damn bald Tianlong was too strong. Although he always pretended to be brave and spoke in a tough tone, he knew in his heart that if he really fought with the damn bald Tianlong, the chance of winning would not exceed 50%. Brother Guangbo. A call awakened Supreme Guangbo from this unpleasant thought. He looked up and saw Supreme Tiehu sitting next to him looking at him with a smile. He said, "This is the best immortal tea that was served a few days ago. It is said to be a rare treasure in the world. To be honest, did you come here specially because you heard about this thing?" Supreme Guangbo laughed and said, "Brother Tiehu still knows me well." While talking and laughing, Song Wenji next to him leisurely walked over and carefully served the immortal tea. Supreme Guangbo glanced at her and was slightly startled. He saw that in the white smoke and the fragrance of the tea, this woman's face was charming and beautiful, but also seemed to have a trace of mystery, which was a kind of soul-stirring feeling. He slightly narrowed his eyes and then said to Supreme Tiehu with a smile, "I guess this must be your famous daughter, Song Wenji?" Song Wenji's cheeks slightly blushed. She took 2 steps back and returned to Supreme Tiehu's side. Supreme Tiehu looked at Song Wenji with affection and said casually, "She is a little girl, how can she be famous?" But speaking of this, he seemed to suddenly think of something. His expression suddenly darkened and he snorted, "It seems that you have also heard about the incident in the rain-tasting tower a few days ago?" Supreme Guangbo smiled and nodded, but in his heart he felt that this old man Tiehu really wanted to save his face. Everyone was on Mount Tianlong, and the incident was so big that even the blind and deaf people on the mountain would know about it. However, he certainly could not say so in order to save his face. After that, Supreme Guangbo said that the dead perverted thief deserved to die, and that Brother Tiehu is old but vigorous, eliminating evil for the people, was really not to be underestimated. Steel Pot Lord was originally very happy, but for some reason, when he heard the words old but vigorous, he suddenly felt a little suspicious and embarrassed. But when he carefully looked at Guangbo Lord, he found that this person's expression was calm and composed, as if he had no other intentions. Supreme Tiehu drank a mouthful of tea and calmly hid his thoughts. Then he said to Supreme Guangbo, "Brother Guangbo, you rarely come to my place, but you suddenly came here today. Perhaps, other than this immortal tea, do you have any advice?" Supreme Guangbo chuckled and nodded slightly, but did not speak immediately. his eyes just casually glanced at Song Wenji, who was standing at the side. Song Wenji immediately felt his gaze and hesitated. She glanced at Supreme Tiehu and moved slightly, intending to leave. However, after being glanced at by her gentle eyes, Supreme Tiehu seemed to be unconcerned and smiled at Supreme Guangbo, saying, "Wenji is the person closest to me, and also the most reliable confidant. Nowadays, there are many important and secret matters that I have entrusted to her. You can speak freely." Supreme Guangbo frowned slightly, feeling a little unhappy. But he was after all a shrewd person, otherwise he would not have been able to maintain the Dezayuan so well under the pressure of the unusually strong Supreme Tianlan and Fuyunji. Therefore, after quickly weighing the pros and cons in his mind, Supreme Guangbo decided to ignore Song Wenji's existence. But before he spoke to Supreme Tiehu, he secretly glanced at the woman from the corner of his eye. He thought to himself, "This woman is indeed a natural foxy beauty. Tiehu is old and muddle-headed. I'm afraid that he will fall for her. To be honest, Brother Tiehu, I indeed have an important matter to discuss with you," Supreme Guangbo said. Supreme Guangbo saw that he was serious and did not seem to be joking, so he immediately became serious. At the same time, he faintly felt that it was not appropriate to let Song Wenji stay. After all, both he and Supreme Guangbo were deity transformation stage supreme. If there was an important matter, it would indeed involve a lot of people. It was better to keep it a secret if possible. However, since he had already said it, there was no reason to take it back. Therefore, after a moment of hesitation, Supreme Guangbo threw this thought to the back of his mind and said, "Brother Guangbo, please speak your mind." Supreme Guangbo said, "Recently, in the Immortal Allies, the people of Fuyunji have become more and more arrogant. They have bullied their fellow Taoists, imposed exorbitant taxes, and exploited the common people. Brother Tiehu must be aware of this, right?" Supreme Guangbo's spirit was lifted, but he did not show any excitement on his face. After a moment of silence, he said, "I have indeed heard of this." Song Wenji stood respectfully behind Supreme Guangbo, looking down and motionless, as if she did not exist here at all. Supreme Guangbo raised his voice slightly and said with some melancholy, "Tianlan, that bastard, does all these evil things all day long. It's really hateful. The day before yesterday he was so domineering that he went directly to the Star Hall to bully Guyu. Brother Tiehu, you are the master of Heavenly Law Hall. The rules of the Immortal Allies should be maintained by you." Supreme Guangbo slightly raised his eyebrows, but he was suddenly furious. "You old man Guangbo, you don't dare to fight against that lunatic Tianlan, so you come to instigate me to fight against him? Do you think I'm old and senile? Do you think I'm a fool?" Supreme Guangbo smiled coldly, and his smile was full of coldness. Chapter 597. Immortal Tiehu was angry, but he was an experienced perfected immortal of Huashan realm, so he did not lose his temper immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath, picked up the teacup in front of him and took a sip. Song Wenji, who was standing beside him, knew her adoptive father very well. She immediately felt the fluctuation of his mood and secretly glanced at Immortal Tiehu. After a while, True Lord Tiehu's expression calmed down. He revealed a smile and said to True Lord Guangbo, "Brother Guangbo, it's not like you don't know the current situation in the Immortal Allies. The Fuyun Agency has always been strong. Now that they have defeated the Devil Cult, their reputation has increased. I don't think anyone in the Immortal Allies can control Tianlan and the others." As he spoke, he shook his head and sighed, looking very regretful. Immortal Guangbo snorted and said with an indignant expression, "I didn't expect Brother Tiehu to be so discouraged. If this goes on, I'm afraid that the righteousness will die out and there will be trouble in the future." Immortal Tiehu raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at Immortal Guangbo. He said with a faint smile, "Brother Guangbo, it seems that you have something to say. Do you have a wonderful plan in mind? You can tell me and let me hear it." Immortal Guangbo said excitedly, "Tianlan and Fuyunji are getting more and more arrogant, and they don't take other people in the Immortal Allies seriously. Not only that, their ambitions are getting bigger and bigger, and their hands are getting bigger and bigger. They have been nibbling away at many industries in the Immortal City. In the past 5 years, the income of the Dzeyuan that I lead has been declining year by year, which means that the income of the Immortal Allies has been decreasing, but Fuyunji is getting richer day by day. The root cause is that Fuyunji is taking advantage of its power to bully others and gradually devour a lot of the output. Immortal Tiehu nodded slowly. With his status, of course, he knew about the changes in Zhengxianming. However, these things were not easy to say, so it was enough for everyone to know in their hearts. Because if one really wanted to be calculative, the 6 perfected lords of Zhengxianming and their forces, apart from perfected Lord Guanghua, all had their own businesses and income in private. It was just a matter of how much they earned. Otherwise, if everyone only waited for a little income from the great slaughterhouse every year, not to mention not having enough to eat and starve, wouldn't they have to depend on Immortal Guangbo for everything? At that time, Immortal Guangbo would replace Tianlan and become a thorn in everyone's side. As for Immortal Guangbo, there was no need for him to have any private property. His Dzeyuan was in charge of Zhengxianmeng's wealth. There were too many opportunities for him to get involved. There was no need for him to do these things. That does make some sense. I've been dissatisfied with this injustice for a long time. However, Fuyunji is powerful now, what can we do? Immortal Tiehu said to Immortal Guangbo seriously. Immortal Guangbo leaned forward slightly and said in a low voice, I see that Tianlan has wild ambitions and is arrogant. Now that he has made a great contribution, if we don't restrain him, I'm afraid he will become the second devil cult in the future. Even though Immortal Tiehu had always been at odds with perfected Lord Tianlan, after hearing Immortal Guangbo's words, his expression changed slightly. He said in a low voice, Brother Guangbo, don't say such things. Immortal Guangbo didn't care at all. He looked at Immortal Tiehu and said, Brother Tiehu, you've always understood the ways of the world. You should know that what I said is true. Immortal Tiehu lowered his eyes and said after a while, If that's the case, what do you have to do? Immortal Guangbo said, For the sake of the world, you and I should join hands to do something so that justice can be reborn and righteousness can be restored. What do you think? Immortal Tiehu was silent for a while and said, This is a big matter. Let me think about it. Are you kidding me? Such a big matter can be decided with just a few words from you, Immortal Guangbo? Immortal Tiehu was very clear that although his subordinates from Heavenly Law Hall were not as valiant as Fuyunji's troops, their combat power was still very high in Zhengxianming. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that they were second only to Fuyunji. But what about Immortal Guangbo's Great Chancellery? That group of corrupt cultivators, from Immortal Guangbo to the ordinary cultivators of the Great Chancellery, lived a life of extreme luxury. They enjoyed their lives, but in terms of combat power, other than Immortal Guangbo, who was the leader of the deity transformation stage perfected lords, the others were simply a burden. The battle between the factions could not be settled by just a few deity transformation stage perfected lords. It would be very tiring to rely on these 2 or 3 people, let alone other things. Driving the tiger to swallow the wolf? Immortal Tiehu sneered in his heart, but on the surface, he also showed a hint of disapproval. Immortal Guangbo saw this. Although he was a little unhappy, he knew that his great chancellery had always given others an impression, so he could only swallow his anger. But since he had specially made this trip, it was impossible for him to be so simple and shallow. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been in charge of the great chancellery for so many years without falling. He smiled faintly and revealed a mysterious expression as he said, I understand Brother Taihu's worries. However, if I have a backup plan that can at least ensure that we have a 70% chance of winning against the Floating Clouds Company, what do you think? Immortal Tiehu and Song Wenji, who had been standing beside him and listening in silence, heard this, and their expressions changed at the same time. What backup plan could have such a big advantage against Immortal Tianlan's faction, which could almost be regarded as the #1 faction in the world? Song Wenji's gaze changed, and her chest rose and fell slightly. She looked a little nervous. Immortal Tiehu also stared at Immortal Guangbo for a long time, and then said in a deep voice, Is there such a thing? Brother Guangbo, please teach me. Immortal Guangbo met Immortal Tiehu's questioning gaze and said lightly, no matter how strong Tianlan and Fiyunji are, they can't be more than 50% stronger than our Zhengxianming. In my opinion, they only account for 40% at most. If the rest of us... Immortal Tiehu instantly understood what he meant and frowned. Have you looked for other people? Immortal Guangbo smiled and said, Guyu was humiliated by Tianlan a few days ago. He is old and has never suffered such humiliation. Yesterday, he quietly came to me. After that, he looked serious and said, if Brother Tiehu agrees, we can secretly form an alliance. At least 3 factions have a big advantage against Fiyunji. I will privately contact Golden Dragon and Flowing Cloud. They must be dissatisfied with Tianlan's arrogance. When they see that we are powerful, how can we not take action together? Immortal Tiehu's thoughts turned quickly, and after a while, he nodded and said, Brother Guangbo's words do make sense. This matter concerns the common people in the world and justice. As the leaders of the righteous, we should rise up. This matter should be carried out quickly. Immortal Guangbo clapped his hands and laughed and said, with Brother Tiehu's words, we will definitely succeed. He paused for a while and then said, if so, I will immediately contact Golden Dragon and Flowing Cloud. We will meet privately in a few days to discuss the important matter. Immortal Tiehu smiled and said, we will rely on Brother Guangbo to take charge of the overall situation. Immortal Guangbo's face showed a hint of joy. Obviously, this was what he wanted to hear the most. He nodded repeatedly and said a few more polite words, and then strode away. The moment he opened the door, a strong wind suddenly blew from outside the main hall, whistling through the towering Sky Dragon Peak, and the world was filled with killing intent. In the main hall, Song Wenji stood quietly, looking at Immortal Guangbo's receding figure with a thoughtful look on her face. Chapter 598. Lu Chen stood where he was, motionless for a long time. His surroundings were silent. There was no one in this underground cavern to begin with, only a red light. Behind him, the guards of the Floating Clouds Agency would definitely not come down without an order. So for a while, it was so quiet that it seemed like there was no life in this place, if there was no Atsu. Atsu was originally following behind Lu Chen. When Lu Chen suddenly stopped, it also stopped. At first, it did not notice Lu Chen's strange behavior. It just stood there casually, and at the same time, it looked at the city in the distance that was bathed in the strange dark red light of the blood moon. The light of the blood moon also fell on Atsu, who was standing next to Lu Chen. However, Atsu did not seem to have any reaction, at least it was not obvious at all. After waiting for a while, Atsu finally felt that something was wrong. It walked in front of Lu Chen and looked up at him. Lu Chen's face did not show any painful expression, but his brows were tightly knitted, as if he was thinking hard about something. However, he still could not find the answer he wanted, and his face gradually showed a blank expression. Atsu thought for a while, rubbed its head against Lu Chen's arm, and let out a low cry. Lu Chen's body trembled. From the countless complicated memories of the past that were like a maze, it seemed like a sudden clap of thunder had suddenly sounded in the sky, and it also seemed like a bolt of lightning had suddenly torn the darkness of the long night, illuminating the world in the shadow for a moment. He woke up with a start and his face was pale. Then, he looked down and saw Atsu standing in front of him. Lu Chen was stunned for a moment. Suddenly, his chest rose and fell, and he looked a little excited. He took a few deep breaths, then walked up to Atsu, gently hugged its neck, and held it in his arms. Atsu was a little stunned. It did not know what happened to Lu Chen, but after so many years, it had already experienced countless life and death situations with Lu Chen. Soon, it felt that Lu Chen's emotions seemed to be not quite right. The man's body was slightly trembling, but he quickly calmed down. His arms were a little tense, as if he was trying to control his emotions, or like a person who was too cold and yearning for warmth. Fortunately, Atsu's body was warm. Its body temperature warmed Lu Chen's chest, and his slightly cold blood flowed again. Atsu stood there quietly. Occasionally it would whimper, but it didn't make any move to break free. It just stayed by Lu Chen's side, using its body heat to warm him up. It even rubbed his face gently, trying to comfort him. This was the first time in many years that this black dog saw Lu Chen show such a weak moment. After an unknown amount of time, Lu Chen's body and emotions had calmed down. When he raised his head from Atsu again, the weak look had disappeared. He had once again become the strong and calm man who seemed to be wearing a thick layer of hard armor. "I'm fine." Lu Chen patted Atsu's head and said softly. Atsu tilted its head slightly and looked at Lu Chen, as if it did not quite believe him. Lu Chen sighed. He did not intend to explain in detail to a dog. After a moment of silence, he turned around and walked back the way he came, which was the passage. Atsu was a little surprised. They had just come down to the underground cave, and they had just walked to the edge. They had not even gotten close to the underground city, and now they were leaving? Lu Chen's face was expressionless. Perhaps he was in a bad mood. He was really not in the mood to search for White Lotus's whereabouts in this large, empty, hell-like city below. Moreover, even if he went to look for her, he might not be able to find her. However, after he took a few steps, Atu barked twice behind him. It sounded a little strange, and there was a hint of dissatisfaction in it. It seemed like even a dog had its own pride. Atu was a little dissatisfied after being dragged along for a walk for nothing. Lu Chen sighed, but he also knew that his behavior was strange. He turned around with a wry smile and said to Atsu, "Atsu, I have encountered a problem now. It's quite troublesome." White Lotus, when he was trying to explain to Atsu, when the two words White Lotus came out of his mouth, White Lotus's figure naturally flashed across his mind, and he thought of White Lotus's appearance. His voice suddenly stopped, and he suddenly frowned. In his memory, that beautiful girl seemed to always be a two-faced person. On one side, she was a vicious and ruthless girl with bloody hands, and on the other side, she was a beautiful and refined gentle girl. It was just that at this moment, the two completely different appearances of that girl seemed to suddenly merge into one, becoming a new and familiar person. And that face seemed to vaguely overlap with a distant and blurry face in the deepest part of his memory. White Lotus, Lu Chen murmured again, and he even shook his head, as if he wanted to get rid of the strange emotions and thoughts in his mind. But his voice finally stopped again, and this time, he completely fell into silence. Atsu was a little confused by Lu Chen. It felt that it had followed Lu Chen for so many years, but it had never seen Lu Chen acting so strange like today. Its eyes rolled a few times, and then it looked up at the high ceiling of the grotto, where the blood moon was shrouded in dark red light. It felt that Lu Chen had been harmed by the blood moon. Was he bewitched? Had he lost his mind? Had he become stupid? Atsu suddenly became a little angry, and it roared at the blood moon in the sky. It roared angrily, and it looked very fierce. But the blood moon in the sky didn't respond to it, as if it didn't care, and it didn't seem to understand this black dog's inexplicable anger. At this time, suddenly, a hand reached out from behind. It was Lu Chen who walked to Atsu's side. He gently stroked the soft and smooth fur of Atsu, and after a moment of silence, he said, "Let's go down. We still have to do what we have to do. Go and find White Lotus." With that said, Lu Chen strode forward. Atu was stunned for a moment. It thought to itself, this person isn't an ordinary fickle person today. It stood on the spot and wagged its tail, but Atu still trotted after him. The quiet underground city, in the red blood light, was like a sleeping giant beast, or a completely dead skeleton. Lu Chen and Atsu, a man and a dog, walked slowly on the street. The doors were wide open, and there seemed to be some kind of strange eyes hidden in them, staring at them. In the quiet space, perhaps there was a terrible voice screaming, calling, and shouting, as if it wanted to drag them down into the abyss to accompany those dead souls. Unknowingly, they walked near the statue, but they didn't find anything unusual along the way. Just as Lu Chen was considering whether to use the stupidest method to start searching nearby, there seemed to be some kind of power here that was responding to the blood moon in the sky. Suddenly, there was a soft but sad cry from a corner of the city. It seemed to be the sad cry of a young girl, and it floated in the air, as if it had crossed many years, returned to this world from the depths of her memory and came to Lu Chen's side. Lu Chen suddenly turned around and looked at the swaying and changing blood shadow in the distance. The long street was silent and there was no one, but at the same time, there seemed to be a strange fog quietly spreading from the street. Chapter 599. His voice was filled with resentment and sorrow. It sounded as if he had suffered the greatest pain in the world, or as if he had a very sad story in his heart and was crying alone in this city. Lu Chen heard the voice, and at the same time, he also saw the mist that suddenly floated up. Most of the mist in the world was white, but here, perhaps because of the light of the blood moon in the sky above, the mist below became a faint red airflow, slowly flowing on the roads, houses, and every corner of this mysterious city. From a distance, it looked like a blood-colored stream, quietly spreading. Atu took a step forward and called out to the thin mist. He looked a little wary, but he didn't seem to be too afraid. Lu Chen's expression was a little solemn. He stared at the red mist that was floating and spreading, and at the same time, listened carefully to the woman's crying voice that floated in this catacomb city. The voice sounded a little erratic, sometimes near and sometimes far, as if separated by a high wall, causing the tone of the voice to change. Therefore, although Lu Chen had some doubts in his heart, he still could not conclude that this voice was the white lotus he was looking for. In addition, Lu Chen also became vigilant in his heart. He had come to this underground city many times. Although the sky was full of red light from the blood moon hanging over his head, and the city was empty, although it looked very strange everywhere, this was the first time such an anomaly had happened. To be precise, it was the first time that the people of Starry Temple had been messing around in this underground city for a long time. No one knew what kind of strange prohibition or formation they had set up in this place. The red mist was slowly approaching, but after listening carefully for a long time, Lu Chen still could not identify the specific source of the sound. After a moment of silence, he gently patted Atsu, who was standing next to him, and whispered, "Can you find the place where the sound came from?" Atsu raised his head to look at the sky, but he did not intend to listen carefully. Instead, he used his nose to sniff the air a few times. After a moment, he seemed to take a hesitant step forward, and then he stopped. He seemed to be carefully distinguishing, and it was rather difficult. Lu Chen did not urge it, but just frowned slightly and looked around. Atsu began to walk and stop, and did not continue to move forward. Instead, it began to circle around the huge statue in the center of the city. It took a few steps forward and sniffed. Just like that, it leisurely circled around the area. Seeing that the red mist was gradually approaching them, and when it was only about 100 feet away from them, Atu suddenly stopped and walked in a certain direction. Lu Chen raised his head and glanced in that direction. He found that the direction Atsu was walking in was a house that did not look much different from the surrounding. The tall door was open, and it was quiet and empty inside. There was already a little red mist in some corners. There were a few stone steps, and the threshold was above the knees. After walking to the door and looking at the house a few times, Lu Chen once again confirmed that the house here looked almost exactly the same, except for the various sizes that were slightly larger than the normal houses in the human world. So, who would have lived here originally? Obviously, Atsu was not interested in this kind of question. It took a few steps forward, first jumped over the threshold, and ran into the courtyard of the house. Then, it raised its head and sniffed a few times, then stared at the direction of the house's backyard and ran there. Lu Chen followed behind Atsu with a cold expression. He glanced around and could clearly feel the smell of blood drifting from that direction. He snorted, and his eyes slowly lit up with a dark flame. His clothes fluttered even though there was no wind, and he slowly walked over. The woman's crying voice suddenly became louder and clearer, as if it was somewhere in front of him. And in Lu Chen's ears, he seemed to feel that the voice gradually became a little familiar. Even the originally vague crying voice seemed to have a few more words. Although most of it was still a little vague, he could hear a few words clearly. But, acacia, flower. Lu Chen's face suddenly sank. He remembered that he had heard this song before. It was on a certain night in Kunlun Mountain, when he was still living in the thatched hut on the cliff outside Su Qingjuan's cave residence. White Lotus came late at night, sat on his windowsill, shook her feet, looked up at the sky, and softly sang that ballad. Suddenly, the depths of his heart twitched, as if a cold knife had suddenly stabbed into it. The piercing pain was suffocating. In front of him, Atsu suddenly roared in a low voice, and its voice suddenly carried a violent aura. Almost at the same time, Lu Chen also felt that the smell of blood suddenly became 10 times stronger. His eyes flashed, and almost without thinking, his body suddenly swept forward, like a lightning bolt. A smear of red light suddenly flashed past, like a bloodthirsty beast pouncing over. Lu Chen's body slightly bent, the black fire on his body instantly flourished, directly turned into a black sword edge and slashed over. The wind whistled, incomparably mournful. That blood light in the air was split apart by the black fire, and emitted a terrifying sound, and then a miserable cry was heard. A person submerged in blood, even his face could not be seen clearly, staggered backwards, but that terrible black fire, like a demon, did not have the slightest intention of letting him go. It directly bit him, surrounded him, and then violently burned him. Lu Chen landed in the air, his body shook greatly, retreated a few steps back. His face also turned pale. The blood man's power was unusually great, even with his current skills, he could not withstand it. Even his chest felt a pain, almost spurting out a mouthful of blood. However, Lu Chen still endured it. He turned his eyes over. Although the bloody man seemed powerful, for some reason, he didn't feel any anger coming from him. Yes, he did not even feel that it was a living person. Blood flowed unceasingly from that blood man's body, like a small river, and looked endless. It was unknown how much blood this person had in his body. A violent aura emanated from his body, but also contained a feeling of weakness and despair. At the same time, the black fire wrapped around the blood man's body. The blood man clearly could not do anything about it. The black fire burned fiercely, and then desperately drilled into the blood man's body. In that instant, Lu Chen thought of many years ago, when he was entangled by the black fire. He was in a desperate situation worse than death, and that indescribable pain. Then he heard that hoarse howl, as if it came from the deepest part of the soul. Lu Chen took 2 steps back, although the blood man in front of him was abnormally powerful, but at this moment, Lu Chen already felt that this monster seemed to have completely lost consciousness. He turned his head to the side, and then his expression suddenly stiffened. He saw White Lotus. Chapter 600. From the moment he rushed into the backyard from the front yard, he was immediately attacked by this strange blood man. It could be said that it was only at this moment that Lu Chen properly observed the situation around him for the first time. Everywhere he looked, everything was bright red. Perhaps it was the curse of the blood moon in the sky. Wherever the blood light shone, the disaster of blood light was inevitable. And this once peaceful backyard was now completely smeared with blood. The scene was unusually mournful, glaring, and soul-stirring. If a timid ordinary person saw this, it was likely that he would faint on the spot. But Lu Chen was not an ordinary person. He had seen countless terrifying scenes in his life, so he was almost not affected by the mournful scene at all. Instead, he instantly judged that the seemingly messy and cruel blood smeared everywhere in the yard seemed to be a battle formation. Moreover, it was somewhat familiar, as if he had seen it somewhere before. Then he saw that in the midst of the blood formation, somewhere in the backyard, there seemed to be a place that looked like a well. Of course, at this moment, the well was almost completely covered in blood. But at the edge of the well, in the dripping blood, at this moment, sat a person. She looked petite, and her body was also covered in blood. But unlike the blood man, her head was exposed, and very strangely, it was not stained with any blood. The area below her neck seemed to be smeared with a layer of blood. Her face was that of a white lotus. At a glance, she looked like a young girl wearing a bright red dress. At this moment, she sat in a pool of blood with her eyes closed. Her brows were also furrowed, and there was a faint expression of pain on her face. From time to time, her face would twitch, but for some reason, she did not say a word, as if she was forcibly enduring it. Lu Chen was startled. Just as he was about to walk forward, his heart suddenly moved. Suddenly, a thought seemed to suddenly flash through his mind, but he did not grasp it. He only faintly felt that he seemed to have missed something. The scene in front of him was tragic, terrifying, and strange, but there seemed to be something not quite right. He stood where he was for a moment, and then he saw that in the blood formation that was smeared on the ground, although there were many concealments or messy bloodstains to cover up, the main part was still the blood-feeding, secret technique that he saw White Lotus once set up. White Lotus, who was able to set up such a vicious and sinister array, was certainly not a pushover. However, everything in front of him still made Lu Chen suck in a breath of cold air. Even when he was still in the devil cult, he had never seen an array of such a scale and abnormally strong spiritual power. He realized that he seemed to have underestimated White Lotus. Roar! A roar came from the side, pulling Lu Chen's gaze away from White Lotus. He looked back and saw Atsu standing at the edge of the blood-feeding secret array, roaring at the bloody man who was being burned by the black fire. Lu Chen was a little worried. He took 2 steps towards Atsu. In the hasty battle just now, although the bloody man was in an abnormally strange state and seemed to be unconscious, his strength was unusually strong. It could be said that he was not inferior to an ordinary Yuanying stage Shinran. He was really a very dangerous person. Atsu had now become very powerful, but in the face of such a mysterious and strange enemy, Lu Chen was still a little worried. But soon, Lu Chen discovered that the bloody man did not attack Atsu. Even though Atsu was roaring at him and exuding obvious hostility, the bloody man was swaying his body frantically and shouting in a messy voice. The black fire was burning on his body. Was he blinded by the terrible pain? Lu Chen hesitated for a moment and called out to Atsu. Atsu turned his head and looked at him, then gave up the confrontation with the bloody man and ran over. However, his eyes still looked back at the bloody man from time to time. Obviously, he was very vigilant against this great enemy. The bloody man did not respond to the actions of Lu Chen and Atsu. His voice was slowly fading away, and his body was half limp, as if he was kneeling on the ground. Lu Chen frowned and looked at the extremely strange bloody man. The wind with a strong smell of blood blew through the underground cave with some whimpers, as if it was a sad cry from ancient times. Lu Chen turned around and strode towards White Lotus. His footsteps stepped on the bloodstains on the ground, leaving 2 lines of footprints stained with blood. Not long after, he came to White Lotus's side, but when he squatted in front of White Lotus, for a moment, he did not know how to start. This girl's body was covered with blood from the neck down. Lu Chen did not know why, but looking at White Lotus's expression, although there was a bit of pain, her spirit was still passable. Lu Chen whispered to White Lotus twice, but White Lotus did not respond, as if she could not hear him. Lu Chen hesitated for a moment, then stretched out his hand and gently patted White Lotus's cheek. As expected, White Lotus reacted. Her body suddenly trembled, but for some reason, her eyes still did not open. Instead, her eyelids twitched a few times, and her lips were tightly pursed and trembling, but she still did not open her eyes, nor did she open her mouth to speak. Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat. White Lotus's reaction was both good and bad. The good thing was that she seemed to still be conscious and responded to external stimuli. The bad thing was that she seemed to be imprisoned by some strange method, unable to open her eyes, and unable to speak. Atsu walked over with Lu Chen. It was obvious that it did not like the surrounding blood-feeding secret spell formation. It looked left and right with a fierce look in its eyes. Even when it looked up at White Lotus, there was no good look in its eyes. It seemed that if it could, it would probably be very willing to go up and bite this girl's beautiful face. At the same time, it would growl from its mouth from time to time. Lu Chen also ignored Atsu. After a moment of silence, he directly reached out and hugged her, ignoring the layer of blood on White Lotus's body. With a low sound, he carried her directly. However, when his hands came into contact with Bai Lian's body, he suddenly frowned and his expression darkened. The layer of blood was too eye-catching, even Lu Chen's eyes were deceived, or it could be said that he did not notice other parts of White Lotus's body. Until this time, when he carried her, he found that White Lotus was not wearing any clothes. This girl was actually sitting naked in this strange spell formation. Lu Chen's face became a little gloomy. Without much hesitation, he directly reached into his arms. After a moment, a faint light flashed, and there was already a cloak in his hand. Then with a shake of his hand, the cloak unfolded and directly wrapped White Lotus in it. Then he turned his head and took a look, only to see that the bloody person had completely fallen into the pool of blood on the ground under the burning black fire. It was motionless, and it seemed that it was no longer alive. Lu Chen glanced at White Lotus in his arms, only to see that her eyes were still closed, and it seemed that she was still trapped in that inexplicable mysterious enchantment. He did not dare to hesitate anymore and strode out. He walked all the way to the door of this big house. The moment he was about to step over the threshold, his heart suddenly moved, but he thought of a place that he seemed to have overlooked just now. White Lotus seemed to have been restrained. So just now, that blurry and strange singing voice in the thin mist, who was it that was singing? Chapter 601. Lu Chen stopped in place and looked down at White Lotus in his arms with some confusion. At this moment, her body was wrapped in the cloak, covering the bright red blood on her body. She didn't look so strange and mournful anymore. Perhaps it was because of the warmth in Lu Chen's arms. White Lotus's expression calmed down at this moment. The original pain on her face lessened a lot, and her eyebrows relaxed. She seemed to know that she was safe and had escaped from the sea of suffering and danger. However, her pair of eyes still hadn't opened until now. It seemed that there was still some kind of restriction on her. Lu Chen's heart slightly moved. The hands that were holding her body slightly tightened, and he carefully used his spiritual power to explore her body. Almost at the moment when his spiritual power entered White Lotus's meridians, Lu Chen suddenly felt an incomparably violent spiritual power like a crazy beast rushing over, crushing his spiritual power in an instant. At the same time, Lu Chen clearly felt that this violent spiritual power from the depths of White Lotus's body was also tearing her meridians, and fragmented scars could be seen everywhere. If this continued, there was no need for others to do anything. As long as White Lotus dragged on for a while, her meridians would be broken and she would die without a doubt. Lu Chen was shocked. He didn't think that White Lotus, who didn't seem to have any injuries on the outside, would have her meridians eroded to such an extent. Just what happened when she was missing? Lu Chen didn't dare to delay any longer. Of course, the most important thing was to leave this place and think of a way to save White Lotus. When he stepped out of the door, he looked at the street in front of him. He found that the strange fog that had just appeared had dissipated at some point. Could it be that the strange thing that happened here was related to the strange bloody man just now? Lu Chen hesitated for a moment. He wanted to go back and check what was wrong with the bloody man. But at this moment, White Lotus suddenly let out a low moan. Her face showed a painful expression again, and at the same time, blood slowly flowed down from the corner of her mouth. Lu Chen was taken aback. He knew that White Lotus's internal injuries were extremely serious and couldn't be delayed any longer. He could only grit his teeth and immediately ran toward the exit of this underground cave. After running a few steps, Lu Chen suddenly realized that Atsu didn't follow him. It seemed that they still stayed in the big house. He couldn't help but frown. He turned back and shouted at the house, "Atsu, go!" In the backyard of the big house, in the tragic scene that was wrapped in the smell of blood, Atsu was indeed still here. It didn't leave this place with Lu Chen. It was probably because when it was about to leave, it sniffed the air with its nose and seemed to have suddenly sensed something. It slowly walked all the way to the bloody man who had fallen to the ground and was on the verge of death from the black fire, but was still submerged in a pool of blood. It didn't step into the pool of blood. Instead, it stood there about 5 or 6 feet away. There seemed to be some doubt in its eyes. It stared at the bloody man for a long time. It wasn't until Lu Chen's shout came from outside the house that Atsu shuddered and seemed to come to his senses. He whimpered a couple of times before turning around and walking out. However, when it was about to leave this courtyard, suddenly, in this already quiet courtyard, amidst the bloody stench and terrifying bloodstains, a low, indistinct, yet seemingly distant singing suddenly sounded. Crescent moon, sing Abizia, time passes like water, white hair flutters. The song was intermittent, the pronunciation was unclear, and there were often missing words in the middle. Ordinary people couldn't understand it, let alone a black dog. Atsu looked more and more confused. It looked back at the bloody man, but the bloody man fell to the ground. He didn't get up, nor did he move. His whole body was covered in blood, and it couldn't be seen if this monster was singing or not. The two looked left, right, and up and down at the sky. All he saw was a sea of blood, but there was not a shadow of a human. Not even the legendary ghosts who would play tricks in such a tragic scene could be seen. The situation looked a little strange. Atsu took a step back, feeling a little creeped out, feeling a little scared, suddenly barked loudly, as if trying to boost his courage, turned around abruptly and dashed out of the courtyard like a wisp of smoke. A cold wind blew, and the courtyard that was covered in blood finally fell into complete silence. There was a hint of desolation. The smell of blood still permeated the air. The bloody man on the ground was bleeding, and the black fire burned for a long time before it was finally extinguished. After an unknown period of time, there seemed to be a finger-like thing moving slightly on the remains of the body in the pool of blood. When Lu Chen was about to run to the exit of the underground cave, he heard a rush of footsteps behind him. He was very familiar with the pace. After all, it was the dog that had been by his side for so many years. He didn't look back. His hands hugged White Lotus and he walked forward quickly. At the same time, he said, "Why did you stay in that place just now? It was weird and there might be danger. Remember to follow me closely next time." Atsu responded with a woof. It raised its head and looked at Lu Chen, then looked at White Lotus in his arms. Then, it quickly ran ahead of them. When Lu Chen rushed out of the tunnel with White Lotus in his arms, the guards of the Floating Clouds Department, led by Lu Ting, all came over. However, when they saw Lu Chen's appearance and the person he was carrying in his arms, even though White Lotus's face was covered by the cloak, all of them were instantly dumbfounded. A few of them even cried out involuntarily, "What's going on?" When Lu Chen went down, everyone saw clearly that there was only one person and one dog. There was absolutely no other person. As for White Lotus, although she wasn't a popular person, her identity and status were not to be underestimated. When she was suddenly carried out of the tunnel by Lu Chen, whether she was alive or dead, everyone's first reaction was that they were in trouble. Not to mention anything else, just the fact that White Lotus had somehow managed to sneak into the underground cavern was a dereliction of duty on all of their part. Now, this person looked completely unconscious, and there were even a few drops of blood dripping from the cloak. When the guards saw this, their scalps went numb and their mouths tasted bitter. Lu Ting was dumbstruck. After being pushed by one of his subordinates who reacted quickly, he suddenly came to his senses. He hurriedly ran over to Lu Chen and asked anxiously, "Young master, what's going on?" Lu Chen wasn't in the mood to explain, but he knew Lu Ting's current predicament and worry. He immediately said decisively, "I discovered that White Lotus was heavily injured. This shouldn't be your fault. I'll bring her back to treat her injuries first. I'll explain it to master and your hall mistress Shui Ying later." Lu Ting's heart immediately relaxed, and the expression on his face also relaxed. He hurriedly waved his hand and said to the people behind him, "Get out of the way, get out of the way. Didn't you hear what young master said? Saving her is more important." But if Lu Chen hadn't taken responsibility just now, Lu Ting probably wouldn't have dared to let White Lotus go. Lu Chen nodded to him and immediately flew off, heading straight for Kunlun Palace. But when he saw the towering eaves of Kunlun Palace, a thought suddenly flashed through his mind, causing him to subconsciously stop in his tracks. White Lotus's internal injuries were strange and incomparably serious. If she was given to true Lord Tianlan to treat her injuries, would he take advantage of this rare opportunity to directly kill her? No matter how he looked at it, this was a great opportunity that no one would be aware of. Even if others were to suspect something, they would probably only suspect Lu Chen himself. Lu Chen frowned and began to hesitate. You're tuning in to the Wandering Hero YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.